The rope went slack in my hands, which was strange because I was holding the middle of it. I had time on the way down to decide that it was rude. The falling was not the rude thing. Falling is weather. The cutting was rude, and I knew who had done it because he had leaned out over the lip to watch me go, and the knife was still open in his hand. Corin Vale had looked me in the face for 2 seasons without once using my name. I still expected better manners from him at the end of it. The floor of the undergate broke my leg in 1 place and my lantern in 4. I lay in the dark and added up my life, and it took no time at all. 19 years, 1 coat, 6 pairs of other men's boots, mended, none of them mine. A guild gone home to its supper. Then the light came down the shaft red instead of white, and it came slowly, as a lamp does when the person carrying it is in no hurry whatsoever. A woman with a crown crouched by my head, near enough that I could see ash caked into the seam of her sleeve, and she said, "Can you cook?" I said, "I cannot stand." She said that was not what I asked, and then she waited, with her elbows on her knees, as though the leg were a separate matter that somebody else would be dealing with. Something came past my ear and took hold of my collar. It was a woman in riding leather with her hair cut off level at the jaw, and she hauled me up that shaft in 1 long pull, complaining the whole way that I was heavier than I looked. I apologized for my weight. She said that was the first sensible thing anybody had said to her all year. She asked my name on the way up. I said Dell. She said that was not a name, it was a noise. Her name was Sevka, and I learned it the way you learn a horse's name, which is by being carried by it. Up in the open, the woman with the crown was already standing there, although I had left her at the bottom. She said, "Who left you down there?" I said, "My guild." She said the name of the man who had done it back to herself twice, the way you repeat directions to a place you fully intend to visit. Then she told me the rule. The only reference she accepted at her court was having been thrown away by your own people. It was 200 years old. She had written it herself. She said I was hired, and she said it like a woman agreeing to buy a fish. I asked her what the hours were. Somewhere above her, back in the dark over the gate, something enormous laughed with its mouth shut. Sevka put me over her shoulder like a grain sack and carried me across a yard whose far end I did not see that night. The word she had used was service. Through the door she carried me into, I could see a kitchen with 3 fires going in it. I am a porter. I did the arithmetic a porter does and came out with carrying, mending, cooking, and turning up on time. Nobody corrected me. It took a year to find out why nobody corrected me, and that reason is everything that happened to me afterwards. The first thing that happened in that kitchen was that a tall woman came in, went straight past the man bleeding on the floor, tasted the big pot, thought about it, tasted it again, and only then looked down at me. She said, "Whoever salted this ought to be made to explain himself." The cook said the salting was mine. She looked at me with a new sort of interest and said, "Then you can stay conscious a while longer." She set the leg. She announced everything before she did it, and every announcement was shaped like a threat. She said, "This will hurt more than the fall did." She said, "If you scream, you will do it quietly." I thanked her after each one, because she was helping me. That confused her badly. She stopped twice to look at my face. Thus, a chatafeistain. Her name was Mirash, and she was the one who kept the poisons, which is a thing I would have liked to know before I started thanking her. In the evening, a gray man came to the doorway of the hall, waited for the room to go quiet, and said the order. He said it from the top down, and he said it in one breath, and it took him about 5 seconds to say who everybody in that hall was. First tonight, Irin Volk. Second, Halva. Third, Sevka. Fourth, Isolde. Fifth, 6th, and 7th, the 3 who were here before the generals. 8th, Mirage. 9th, the man. Atsi Idikibais Andais, I was the man. It took me a while to work out that being called the man instead of a name was not rudeness, it was bookkeeping. At that table, your place was your name, and mine was the last one. Then one of the 3 old ones stood up, said that Isolde had ridden further that week than she had, and sat down 1 place lower for it. Nobody looked up. The gray man, whose name was Barrow, corrected the order without any change of tone at all, as though he were mentioning weather. I took from this only that these people rearranged themselves at supper, which struck me as a lot of trouble to go to for soup. Mirage put a bowl in front of me herself and stepped back to watch. I ate it, because I had not eaten since morning, and it was the first hot thing anybody had handed me in 2 seasons. Halfway down the bowl, I noticed the entire hall watching me eat. I said, "Is there something wrong with it?" Mirage said, "That is what I was intending to find out." Then she stood up. She said that the man sat above her tonight because in 200 years he was the first person to finish her cooking without checking it, and that she would like that kept in the order. Barrow said the number as he had said all the others, with no ceremony in it whatsoever, and then went straight on to announcing the second dish. The number was 8. I did not know what it meant. I noticed only that the hall had turned to look at me, that Sevka was sitting there with her mouth open, and that not one person thought it worth explaining to the man it had happened to. Corin Vale came through the gate the next morning with 2 men and a face he had put on for the occasion, and asked for the return of guild property. He did not see me. I was against the far wall with a mop, because the floor was mine now, and a man with a mop is furniture. Barrow met him in the doorway and said, "You will be seated." Vale said he had not come to eat. Barrow said, "You will be seated," and there was no argument anywhere in it, because Barrow does not argue. He says the order, and the order is not a thing you argue with. They put him at the end of the table, where the wood is not finished, below the 8th place, because at that court a man is placed by who threw him away, and nobody had ever thrown Corin Vale away in his life. Then Barrow said the order for the morning, top down, 1 breath, and the 8th place got its man. And its man came over with the mop still in his hand and sat down above him. I would like to tell you I planned it. I had been told to sit, so I sat. Vale looked at me for a long moment, which was the longest he had ever looked at me, and then he said, "Is that water fresh?" And I said it was, and I poured it for him. He drank it. He drank water poured by the property he had come to collect, and the property was sitting 1 place above him, and the whole hall watched him work that out over the rim of the cup. He said, "I have come for a man of the Iron Lantern, who remains the responsibility of the Iron Lantern." Barrow said, "He is 8th. Vale said, "That means nothing to me." Barrow said, "It means he is above you." Then Barrow did the thing that decided the following year, and he did it in his ordinary voice, without appearing to know he was doing anything at all. He said that the envoy of the guild would be seated by this same order every time he came, however many times that turned out to be. Vale left before the second dish. Sevka said into her cup that she hoped he would come often, and that she hoped he would bring more men with him, so that there would be more of them to seat. Later somebody asked me what my reference was. I said my guild had cut the rope with me on it. The table went quiet in a way I misread entirely, because I thought I had said something shameful. Then Halva said that being cut loose was a decent enough reference, but that her own people had burned her banner rather than pay her a share of what she had won them, and that she held burning to be worse than cutting. Irin Volk hummed once before she spoke, "Atakadats akin autotafam," which is a thing I learned to listen for, and said that her garrison had shut her own gate with her standing outside it, and that a gate takes considerably longer than a rope. Sevka said her lot had sold the ground under her feet for the right to use a road. Marash said her order had poisoned her first to be certain of the dose, and said it as you would name a school you had attended. They argued about it for the length of 2 dishes, seriously, with feeling, and once loudly enough that Barrow had to say the order again from the top. I sat at the bottom of all this and understood that every person at that table had arrived by the same road I had. It was not the comfort you might think. It explained why nobody had asked me for a letter, and it explained the crown, and it left about 400 other things unexplained. I worked that kitchen sitting down for the next few days, because I could not stand for longer than it takes to boil water. Sitting down, a man learns a kitchen from the bottom, which is where a kitchen keeps everything it knows. By the end of the first evening, I knew that Iron Volk will not touch vinegar, that Isolde eats nothing she has not watched cooked, that Halva eats twice and says she ate once, and that the mistress of the place eats last out of habit and will not admit it. I said all of that out loud at the door, to nobody, as you empty your head before sleeping. Barrow was standing there. He wrote nothing down. From the next evening, he said it aloud before every meal, at the end of the order, in exactly that voice, and he has never once given any sign of finding it worth doing. I asked the cook what to call the mistress. She wanted to know what to call me first, and I said Dell, and she said that was a short name for a boy with a leg in that condition. Then the kitchen stopped moving. Barrow answered from the doorway, because answering is his duty, and he said Kadresh. So I said Kadresh out loud in front of people, because that is what you do with a name once you have been given it. I have since worked out that in that hall there were exactly 2 of us who said it, him on duty, me out of ignorance. The argument over who had the right to carry me went on for 2 days. Halva claimed it on the grounds of owning a banner, Iran Volk claimed it on the grounds of load. Mirash claimed it medically. Sevka won it by the method of already carrying me while the others talked. Nobody told me where I slept. I asked twice and got 2 changes of subject so graceful that I assumed the answer was embarrassing. So I lay down on the kitchen floor by the banked fire, because that is where the kitchen slept. In the morning, Halva found out where I had slept and had to sit down. Sevka wanted to know how 9 people had managed to let it happen. Not one of them would say a word about it in front of me, and the kitchen was too polite to tell me, and so I mopped. That evening, Kadresh spoke to Barrow at the head of the table without lowering her voice, and said that from tomorrow the man carries her things. The hall went quiet as a hall does at an announcement, rather than at a shock. Sevka put her cup down. Halva closed her hand round the bell at her wrist to stop it ringing. Isolde smiled at the wall. I heard carries her things, and I was pleased, because carrying things is a normal job, and I had begun to worry that this one was not. Vale came back at the end of that week and said the same thing again in a different order, and was seated in the same place while he said it. On his way out, he stopped Barrow in the yard and said, "What is the name of the one who sits 8th?" Barrow told him the court does not announce names, it announces places. Then he went in to say the order, and Vale stayed in that yard to hear it through the door, and so did I, standing in the dark with a bucket in each hand. We both heard my number. Only one of us knew what it meant. I came round the corner with a mop and a bucket, and found the entire court standing in the entry in their socks. Nobody was talking. Iron Volk was nearest the door with her boots held out in one hand like a thing that had bitten her. Halva had gone up on the balls of her feet. The 3 old ones stood in a row along the wall like birds on a rail, and one had darned his heel in a color that did not match. I said good morning and went past all of them into the hall, because the board by the fire had a burnt patch that wanted lifting, and only in the middle of that afternoon did I understand they had been waiting since first light for somebody else to go first. The evening before, I had said in a doorway, with a bucket in my hand, that if people would leave their boots at the door, I would not have to wash the same floor twice a day. That is the whole of it. I was tired, my leg hurt, and I wanted to sit down on something that was not a step. That court, a thing said out loud in a doorway, is an order of the house. The shame is not in obeying it. The shame is in being the last one in the room to work out that it applies to you. And every one of them had spent the morning trying not to be that person, and none of them could ask. So 9 people, who between them had ended sieges, stood in their stockings in a cold entry for most of a morning, in case they were the one who broke it. Barrow came through at the usual hour, said the order for the day to a room of people in socks, and did not appear to see anything worth remarking on in any of it. Sevka broke it. Sevka came in from the yard at a run, with rain on her shoulders, saw the row of them, said, "What in the name of the ash are the lot of you doing standing there?" and sat down on the step and pulled her boots off and dropped them on the flags, one and then the other. After that, there were 2 sounds in that house you could name without looking up. Barrow saying the order, and Sevka's boots hitting stone. She is the only one who ever really did it. The rest of them carried theirs to the door and set them down like eggs. Next morning I carried Kadresh's things, because Barrow had said the man carries her things, and I am a porter, and it was the first work in 11 days that made any sense to me at all. Her load was packed by an idiot. The heavy end was up and the soft end was down, which is how you get a man walking crooked by noon and lame by dark. So I put it on the mounting block in the yard, opened it, and packed it again in front of her. She stood and watched me do it. I said, "Whoever did this before was trying to break somebody's back." And I said it as you say it in a yard, because that is where we were. The yard went entirely quiet. 2 stable hands stopped with buckets in their hands. Isolde was at the window above us, which had already been open before she came to it, and she studied me until I was finished, and then wrote it down in the only place she keeps anything, which is her head. Kadresh looked at the repacked load. Then she said, "Do it that way from now on," and picked up her gloves and went in. And I thought, good, that is settled, and got on with my morning. I see one ni say di wine, daos nai. Know now what a court sees when a man opens the queen's load in daylight and tells her the packing is wrong. It sees a man who is permitted to handle what generals are not permitted to touch. It took Halva 3 days to hear about it in a field, and she rode all night to find out who had been given that, and she arrived at the worst possible moment. That comes later. The gate wanted looking at. It was the big western one, and Irene Volk stood at it, which is what she had been doing for 40 years, and when the wind came down off the pass, she put her shoulder to the leaf and held it. I asked her why she held it. She hummed once, low, the way she does before words come out, and said, because it walks. It did walk. The leaf had dropped on its pin and the ground had risen up to meet it, so the thing rode up on itself every time it swung, and any carpenter alive would have looked at that for 4 seconds and gone off to find a wedge. I went and found a wedge. Then I asked her to hold the door still while I got grease into the top pin because I could not reach it and hold it at the same time, and I said please, because my mother raised me somewhere. She took it as an order. I have turned it over many times since, and I do not believe there was any other way she could have taken it. She set her feet, put both hands flat on the timber, and held that door for as long as it took me to work grease into a pin, and she held it the way you hold a breach in a wall. 2 of her people came up at the change to relieve her. She said, I am under instruction. They went away and stood at a distance and watched their general hold a garden gate for a man on a stool. Then I knocked the wedge in and took it out again and shaved it and knocked it in properly, and the leaf came down and sat on it, and the gate swung shut on its own weight for the first time since before I was born. It made the small, dull sound a door makes when it is a door. Erin Volk looked at it. She said, 40 years. I said, it is only the ground. It comes up under everything. You would have had the same trouble with a barn. She hummed and said nothing else at all for the rest of that afternoon, and at dusk she was still standing there, watching it not need her. The guardroom is a stone box by that gate, with a stove in it, and it has its own government. They keep an order of places, and the places are crates. There is the good crate by the stove. There is the long crate that seats 2, provided neither of them is Erin Volk. Then there is the floor. They say it out loud when they sit down. I thought at first they were mocking Barrow, and I nearly laughed, which would have been the worst thing I did that year. They were not mocking anybody. The senior says it standing, with his cup held like a man at a funeral, and the rest wait. That evening, he told a man off the good crate and put me on it, and said out loud whose crate it had been for 6 years and why it was not his any longer. It was because the gate had shut by itself that morning, and the gate is theirs, and the man who wedged it eats warm. The man who lost the crate agreed with him. That is what I could not get used to for months. He agreed out loud, in front of everybody, and then complained bitterly that he should have been the one to say it first, and 2 others took his side, and it turned into an argument about who had noticed the gate earliest. I sat on a crate by a stove and listened to 4 grown soldiers quarrel about which of them had lost to me soonest. I started taking them the thin soup. There is always thin soup in a kitchen that feeds a court, because the good of the pot goes up to the table, and what is left under it goes to the pigs. The senior had my name off me the second night, and called me Dell after that, which at that gate is a promotion. They asked me what it was. I said, it is what was left. They ate it and did not talk while they ate. And afterwards, the senior one took the bowls to the trough and washed them himself, which I am told had not happened in that room in the memory of anyone in it. Vale came back on the 9th day with a new approach, and his new approach was to stop speaking to me at all. He stood in the middle of that hall and addressed the head of the table directly, one office to another, and he had rehearsed the first line, because it had a shape to it that his mouth did not. He said, my guild asked the court to release a man in its service, and to consider the matter closed between us. Adresh let him finish. She let him finish twice, in fact, because he said the last half of it again, when nobody answered. Then she looked over at me, where I was standing against the wall with a jug in each hand, and she said, tell him. So I told him. I turned round and said, she says she has heard you. I said it the way you carry an order out of a kitchen, at that pace, because that is exactly what I thought I was doing. Vale had to stand there and take his own demand back out of the mouth of the porter. He had dropped down a shaft, and then he had to answer me, because I was the one who had spoken, and there was nobody else in the conversation. He said, and what does she say to it? I said, I will ask. I asked. She said, tell him no. I turned around and said, she says no. And he said, then ask her whether the guild may send its master. And I said I would ask, and I asked. And she said, he may sit at the bottom like anybody else. We went on like that for most of a dish. By the end of it, he had stopped looking at Kadrish entirely and was arguing with a man holding 2 jugs. At the meal that night, Erin Volk stood up before Barrow had finished the second half of the order, which is not done, and Barrow had to go back to the top and say the whole thing again from the beginning in order to accommodate her. She said, tonight the man sits above me, she said. The western gate shut by itself this morning. It has not done that since I came here, and it was not war that did it. It was a wedge and a spoonful of grease. and I am too old to stand up and pretend I did not notice a thing I noticed. Barrow said, "Sitzel, I shall bintachele by Sveneth." Then he said the second dish had been standing about for some while now, and asked whether the house intended to eat it. And the house sat down and ate it. Then, because a person has to put her hand somewhere after saying a thing like that in front of a room, Iren Volk took out the knotted cord she measures walls with and measured the doorframe of the hall twice and told nobody the number and wrote it nowhere and put the cord away and ate. Sevka started laughing and could not get herself back. She said, "Seventh," and then she said, "Ashen Iron Boy, do you not know what you are?" And she got precisely that far. Mirage took her by the collar and pulled her backwards off the bench without letting go of the glass in her other hand. The glass did not spill. That tells you how many times she has had to do that in her life. And I watched a general hauled away from a table by the neck for beginning a sentence that had my number in it, and I came to the only conclusion available to a man in my position. I decided I was being dismissed. It fitted everything I had. They talked about me and stopped when I came in. The mistress of the house had taken a personal interest in my packing. Somebody had just been dragged off in the middle of saying it out loud, which is what you do when the man is still in the room and has not been told yet. So I did what you do. I was up before the baker. I scrubbed the entry twice over on my knees. I mended 4 pairs of boots that had been left at the door and set them back in pairs facing the wall, and I did not sleep at all. Barrow found me at that hour sanding the burnt patch out of the board by the fire. He looked at me for a moment, over the top of the candle he carries and has never once needed, and he said, "The order will be at the usual time," and went away, and I took that for a bad sign, because in my experience, nobody tells you anything at the end. I went down to the morning meal with my coat brushed and my speech ready, and the speech was going to be, "Thank you for the work, and I am sorry about the floor," and instead of dismissing me, they gave me a door. Barrow said it in the middle of the order, between the 4th place and the 5th, in the voice he uses for weather and for war. He said, "The door to her rooms is dragging on the sill," and then he carried on down to the 9th place without a pause, and the fish came in. So I went up and looked at it. The pin had rusted where the rain came in past a bad shutter, and the sill had swelled with the wet, and the whole thing groaned like a cow whenever anybody moved it. I took the pin out, cleaned it back to metal, planed a hair off the sill, put it together, and it swung sweet. That was the second morning of my first month at that court, and it is the exact hour I stopped being a man who washed floors. Nobody mentioned it. I went on washing floors for 8 months more, because what I had done in the arithmetic of that house was take charge of who goes through that door. Mirage came up an hour later, stopped a good pace short of the threshold, and said, "May I go in?" I said, "It is dry now. You are all right." She stood working through that answer, and then went in with the face of a woman who has been handed more than she asked for, and has no intention of handing it back. They all did it after that. Iren Volk hummed at me from the top of the stair, and waited to be released. One of the old ones asked me twice in a single day, and thanked me both times. I kept telling them the floor was dry, and they kept looking grateful, and neither side had the first idea what the other one was saying. Ice, Yonda. Sold the quiet, I met properly in her own room, which is at the back over the stables and has 9 doors in it, and every one of them was already open by the time I got there, with the bread. She did not say hello. She said, "You took the pin out at the 14th hour and had it back before the light went. You have gone down to the kitchen 3 nights running, and you sleep with your boots where your hand falls." I said, "All of that is true." She said, "So you are going down to be where she passes." I said I slept in the kitchen because the kitchen is warm and the kitchen sleeps there. And Isolde looked at me with the vast patience of a woman who has listened to men lie professionally for 200 years. She has 900 listeners on this continent. Not one thing they hear is ever put down on anything. She says it out loud once in the room where it matters, and after that it is weather and it moves on its own. That night she said it to Kadrish at her shoulder in front of half the hall. She said, "The man goes down at night to be where you pass." I was 6 feet away with a jug and I heard it, and I assumed she was talking about the drains. Kadrish put her cup down and said, "And what does he do when I pass?" Isolde said, "He stands up." Kadrish said, "He stands up when anybody passes." Somebody raised him and picked the cup back up again, and that was the only correction she made to any of it. She did not look at me once while she said it. She had the face of a woman who has decided to let an error run and see where it gets to. I came to know that face very well. Number moved on the 3rd day of that week, and nobody stood up to move it. and that unsettled me more than the dismissal I had been waiting for. There was a guest at the table, a horse dealer up from the low road with a wet hat, and halfway through the first dish, he asked out loud why the man was sitting seventh. And one of the three old ones, who has been at that court since before there were generals, leaned across and told him. He explained it kindly. He explained it in about 4 sentences, and he was enjoying himself, and he got as far as saying that the gate had been shut for the first time in 40 years. Barrow was in the doorway with the order in his mouth. He waited for the old man to finish, which took a while, and then he said the order for the evening from the top in one breath, and he put 2 things into it without any change of tone whatever. He said the old one was 9th until the next meal, for explaining a man his place, and he said the man was 6th. I put both hands flat on the table and said, I have not done one thing today. Barrow said, no. Sevka put her face into her hands. The old man who had gone down to 9th carried his cup to the bottom of the table, sat, and said to the horse dealer, now you have seen it. I said it again, because I did not care for it at all. I said, he goes down and I come up, and I have not lifted anything heavier than a bucket since breakfast, and I would like it put back where it was. Barrow said, the order is said once before the meal. It is not said twice. Then he asked whether anybody at the table was waiting on the bread, and 2 people said they were, and it was over. I was not grateful. I had watched an old man lose his chair for being kind to a stranger with a wet hat, and I had been paid for it in a currency I did not know I was holding, and nobody had asked me. 2 centuries of custom had reached over my head and moved me the way you move a cup to wipe under it. Isolde took the dry flower from behind her ear, put a different one there, and told the hall that the man was displeased because he had wanted to rise on a day when a particular person was present to see it. Sevka said, that is not what that is. Isolde said, 900 listeners, Sevka said, and every one of them wrong at once, and Mirash tapped her glass twice with her spoon, without looking up, which is how that woman says, be quiet. It was around then that I understood I was living in a house where everybody knew everything about me, and not one of them was right. Vale came back the following week, stood in that hall, and told them I was dead. He had built a version and practiced it. He said, the man you speak of was lost in the collapse at the Undergate. The guild grieves him. What remains is the closing of the matter between us. The hall did not gasp, which is the thing about that court. Halva put her knife down flat. Irenvolk hummed once and did not use it, and one of the old ones said, in a tone of pure administrative curiosity, then who is sitting 6th? I was 4 steps behind Vale with a tray of cups on my shoulder. I set the tray down first, because you should not hold a tray while contradicting a man, and I said, I am not dead. Vale turned round. I said, you leaned out over the lip to watch. The knife was open in your hand, and the light was good enough for me to see your face from the bottom, so it was good enough for you to see mine from the top. I am not saying it to shame you. I am saying it because you have just told 9 people a thing that is not so, and one of the 9 is me. He said nothing for a while. Then he said, the light was bad. Sevka said from the far end of the table, without raising her voice, that the light in this hall was excellent, and that she would gladly hold a lamp for him if he wished to try it again. Solda stood up. She did not stand to move a number. She stood to speak, and there is a difference in that house which everybody but me knew. She said the man had told a plain truth where it would cost him and buy him nothing, and that 900 mouths would have it by morning. Barrow said the fish was ready. She did not stand for my number. I noticed it, and I could not read it. She was keeping that, and she kept it for 8 months more, and when she finally spent it, she spent it on the loudest day of my life. What was said inside the guild that week, I had a long time afterwards from Isolde, who had it from a man who sweeps their stair, and it went like this. Eldrin Voss sat with his back to the fire, and let Corin Vale stand in front of him. Voss is master of the guild. He is 60 years old, and he has the voice of a man who has never once been interrupted in his life. Was nature duisbant sai, he said, the pass through the ash march. Say it back to me. Vale said, without it, we are finished by winter. Voss said, and who is the pass now? Vale said, the court is. Voss said, no. The pass is a boy who carried your bag for 2 seasons, and you put a knife to a rope with him hanging on the end of it, and now that boy is the pass. Mend it. Do not go near him. If he dies of a fever this winter, I will hold you answerable for the weather. Vale said, he is a porter. Voss said, he is seated, and that was the end of the conversation. And I am told Vale stood in that room a good while after the master had gone out of it. Alva arrived 4 days later at a gallop, came into the yard scattering hens and one stable boy, and was off the horse before it had properly stopped. There is a small bell at her wrist. It goes on ringing for a while after she stops moving, and she has never in her life acknowledged that it exists. She came into the middle of the meal with the rein still on her and said, "Where is the man who insulted him?" Nobody asked her which him, and that is what I kept from that day. Iren Folk pointed with a spoon at the bottom of the table, where the wood is not finished, and said, "There. Halva seichai espas." Halva took her time about looking at Corin Vale, and Corin Vale looked into a bowl, and she said, "Oi travanda by Sarasen, you are a good deal shorter than I was told." Barrow said that no duel is arranged before the end of a meal, that the meal had 2 dishes left to run, and asked her whether she would be eating. She sat down. She ate both dishes. She rang the entire time, and every time she reached for the salt, the hall filled up with the sound of it, and Vale sat under that noise at the far end of the table with his hands in his lap. Then he went out to his horse, stopped in the yard with his foot in the stirrup, and came back in before the doors were shut. He said he had a proposal. It was the only clever thing he did that whole year, because for the first time since I had come there, nobody in that hall knew what they were supposed to say next. The proposal was that the guild would buy me back. Vale said it at the unfinished end of the table with his hat in his hands, and he said it well. The Iron Lantern acknowledged an irregularity. No house should be out of pocket for another house's irregularity, and the guild was prepared to make the court whole. I was behind him with a jug. By then my leg had knitted enough to stand a whole meal, which meant I had been promoted from a man on a stool to a man on his feet, and nobody had marked that either. I said, "Does the offer include my boots?" I would like it understood that I was not being clever. They were guild issue. They were on my feet at the time of the rope. And if there was going to be an accounting, I did not want to be walking home in the snow afterwards. The hall took the question seriously. Iren Volk hummed and said boots were part of a man's carriage and could not be separated from him without a further sum. Another of them said they had lain at the bottom of the undergate and were therefore salvage. Halva said cutting a thing loose is a form of giving it away. Sevka said, "They are terrible boots." They went at it for the length of a dish, and Vale stood through all of it with his hat in his hands, while 9 people argued the ownership of a pair of boots I had mended twice myself, and nobody once took up the half of the offer that had a sum in it. Kadresh never answered him at all. She let the boots run to the end, and then Barrow said the second dish was ready, and that was the answer. And Vale understood it because he sat down and ate. Nobody at that court spoke of money again in all the time I was there. I am told they find the subject coarse, as other houses feel about discussing illness at table. Halva took up following him. She did not challenge him, and she did not speak to him. She went where he went about that yard with the bell on her wrist at a distance of 4 paces, and looked at the back of his head. He tried to check a girth with her behind him. He tried to eat standing at the stable door and gave it up halfway through. Once he turned round and asked her what she wanted, and she said nothing at all, and stayed exactly where she was, and the bell went on going. I have seen a man challenged to a duel, and I have seen a man followed by a bell for an afternoon, and I know which of the two I would take. Taster business began the same week, and it began because a pot was hot. I brought her food and set it in front of her first, which is Porter's manners, and then took the first mouthful off the top of it, which is also Porter's manners. You do it because a kitchen sends things up scalding, and because the man carrying is the one who knows how long it has been carried. I had done it 4 times a day for 2 seasons, for men who never once thanked me for it. The hall stopped eating. Mirage set her glass down so carefully that it made no sound at all, which from her is shouting. She said, "On what grounds?" I said, "On the grounds that it is hot." She said, "That is not what you did. In this house, the first mouthful off that plate is taken by one person. It has been me for the last 140 years. I have never been asked to explain the arrangement, and I am not going to begin explaining it to you." I said I was sorry. I said the kitchen had been sending things up too hot all week, and I would speak to them. Then I went to the door and told the kitchen to stop sending things up too hot, and when I came back, the entire table was still looking at the place where I had been standing. Arash was furious and delighted at once, and I could not read either of them then. What I know now is that a woman who has spent a century arranging to die instead of somebody else had the arrangement taken off her by a man who thought he was managing the heat of a soup. Then, two of them stood up at the same instant, and I found out that a house with an order of places also has a rule for what happens when two people try to move it at the same time. Halva was up with the bench going over behind her, saying he sits above her tonight, because he took the first mouthful without being asked and without knowing what it was. Mirash was up in the same breath with the same words, and got as far as, because he has taken my work. Barrow said, "One moment." Then he established in front of everybody which of them had risen first, and he did it by the bell. He said the bell at Halva's wrist had sounded before Mirash's bench had moved, that the bell was the earlier sound, and that the house would go by the bell. Halva won it by a breath. The number came down to fifth, and then Barrow said that as the higher standing was settled, the lower one was of no effect, and Mirash was told to sit down again with her reason still unspent. There is no worse thing you can do to that woman. Yielding cost her nothing at all. Being sat back down with her reason still in her mouth cost her the whole evening, and she took it out on a bowl of soup that had done nothing to anybody. She came down to the kitchen afterwards and stood in the doorway while I scoured the pot. She said, "You will not do that again." I said I would not. She said, "You will do it again." I said, "Probably." And she made a noise and went away, and I found the good knife sharpened in the morning. Fifth. I had been under that roof 3 months. I still could not have told you what a general was for, and I was sitting fifth at a table, where the woman below me had ended a siege before my grandfather was born. Halva was so pleased with herself that she had the banner out before the plates were cleared and started unpicking a corner of it. She has been embroidering that banner since her own people burned the first one, and she is not good at it, and nobody has ever told her. Wansai Vale came back with a horse. I want to be fair to him. It was an extremely good horse. He brought it into the yard the way you bring a thing you have paid too much for, waited until there were 15 people watching, and offered it to Sevka as a gift between houses. Sevka walked all the way around it twice, once in each direction. Then she gave him the fullest answer that anybody gave anybody that year. She said, "That is a good horse." She said it will carry a man in armor for 1 day and be lame on the second. It will not eat what it does not recognize. It will not stand when there is thunder. It will not bite a man who deserves biting. And it will not come when it is called. Vale said, "And yours will." She took the cracked whistle out of her collar and blew it. It is a poor sound. It is the sound of a whistle with a split down the side, and it goes flat at the end of the note. Something came out of the dark at the far end of that yard at a speed I did not care for, put its head over Sevka's shoulder, and looked at Corin Vale, and Corin Vale took 1 step backwards into a water butt. Sevka said, "That is what mine does." The horse stayed. Nobody ever mentioned it again, and it was still there a year later, eating well and doing nothing whatever, and the guardroom named it after him. The night hour started with me complaining. I said, in the kitchen, with the door standing open, that I had been up at the 4th hour for 11 weeks, and that a man cannot go on like that, because a man is not a horse and has to sleep in the dark, or he stops being any use to anybody. I said it to the cook. Barrow was in the passage. He asked me, in the flattest voice on this continent, how long a man requires. I said 6 hours if he must, and 8 if you want him thinking, and he said nothing, and went away. And the next evening, he put it at the end of the order. He says it after the places, and after who does not eat what. He says the house is quiet from such an hour to such an hour, and the house has been quiet from that hour to this one ever since. And to this day, he behaves as though it had thought of it by itself. The generals took it as an instruction handed down from somewhere. Isolde told the court that the man required darkness, and let that stand for a week without correcting it. And I do not know to this day whether she was making a joke, because that woman has no face at all. Kadrish went up when he said it. That was all. A woman 200 years crowned heard a porter's bedtime read out as an order of her own house, and got up and went, and I was too busy stacking bowls to understand what I had just watched. Mirash came down to the kitchen at the end of that week, and gave me her spoon. It is a small dull thing, with a mark cut into the metal near the bowl of it, and she put it on the block in front of me, without any ceremony at all. She said, "If it goes black, put the plate down and come and find me." She said, "Do not wash it in anything but water." She said, "It is not a present." I said thank you and put it in my apron. And that night I used it to stir the thin soup in the guardroom, and the senior guard watched me do it and made the sound of a man swallowing a bone. Sevka got as far as the second word this time. She said, "Listen to me. You are not the kitchen. You are the. And Iron Volk reached over and took her by the collar with one hand and lifted her backwards off the bench with it, while measuring the wall behind her with the other, and did not lose her count. Sevka said from the floor that this was not fair and that somebody was going to have to tell me sooner or later. She called me Del while she said it, which she had done since the boots, and which nobody at that table ever did. Iron Volk hummed once and said no and went on measuring. Vale left the next morning with nothing, which by then was his ordinary condition. At the gate he stopped and said, loud enough for the guardroom to hear him, that he would come back with the master of his own house, and that the master would not be seated at the wrong end of anybody's table. The senior guard wrote nothing down and forgot none of it. He told the kitchen. The kitchen told me. And for 11 days, that entire house went about its work, waiting to see where Barrow was going to put Aldrin Voss. Aldrin Voss came up the west road on the 12th day, with 6 men behind him, and Corin Vale riding at his shoulder, and he timed it for the middle of the afternoon, so that the whole house would be out of doors to watch him arrive. He is 60. He has white hair cut close and a good coat, and the voice of a man who has not been interrupted since he was 30. When he speaks, he leaves a small space after each sentence for people to agree in. I was on the roof of the woodshed with a hammer. That is worth knowing, because out of everything that happened in the next hour, what I remember best is hearing all of it from up there, while nobody thought to call me down. Barrow met them in the entry and said, "Wan Bunan, Wan Gakets, you will be seated." Voss said he had come to speak with the crown and not to eat. Barrow said, "You will be seated," and turned around and went in to say the order. He said it top to bottom without stopping once. He put Vale on the rough wood at the foot of it, where Vale had been sitting for 5 months. Then he put Aldrin Voss, master of the Iron Lantern, below him. There is a stool down there. It is not even a chair. It is the stool the kitchen stands on to bring up the big pot, and it was carried in for him while he was still on his feet by a girl of about 14 who did not look at him. Voss did not sit. He said, "I think there has been an error." Barrow said there had not been. Voss said, "That man works for me." Barrow said, "He is 4th from the bottom of this table, and you are 3rd, and asked whether the master would be taking fish. One of the old ones, the same one who lost his chair in the spring, opened his mouth to be helpful. Barrow said, without turning his head, "If you finish that sentence, you will be sitting where he is sitting." The old man shut his mouth. So Voss stood at the foot of a table with 9 people already eating at it, and the whole arithmetic of his own humiliation locked up behind a rule that no living person was allowed to say out loud to him. Then he sat on the stool, because there was nothing else on offer. I worked it out myself 2 days later, from the guardroom, and the guardroom had worked it out on the first night. At that court, your place is set by whoever threw you away. Vale had been sent out of that hall 5 times by then. Voss had never been sent out of anywhere in his life. 5 refusals is a service record. Nothing at all is nothing at all. The master of that guild sat below his own deputy for the length of that visit, because nobody had ever found him unwanted, and the only cure for it was to be thrown away by somebody, and it was too late in the year for that. He gave them the version over the first dish, and he gave it well. He said the rope at the undergate was old and had been reported old, that the failure was a failure of rope and not of men, that the collapse followed from the failure, and that a man was lost and the guild carried the weight of him. I came down off the woodshed at the end of that and stood in the passage with the hammer still in my hand, listening to a stranger explain how I had died. The court took it as it takes weather. Iron Volk 8. Isolde looked at the ceiling. Halva had the banner out and was working at a corner she had already unpicked twice. And Barrow came in halfway through the sentence about the weight of him and announced the second dish. Voss stopped. He said, "I am speaking." Barrow said the second dish was on the table and would go cold, and stood there while the plates went round, and then said, "Please continue," and Voss could not find the beginning of it again. Nobody in that hall wanted proof. Neither of those men ever understood that, right to the end. There was no doubt in the room for their evidence to fasten onto, because everybody in it already knew what had happened at that rope, including the 2 of them. Court with 9 former corpses at the table does not treat a cut rope as a mystery. They treat it as a reference. The only man there who might have wanted the matter looked into was me, and I was in the passage with a hammer, waiting to be told which pots to carry. Voss said one more thing and got one answer. Kadresh said, "What say k sides? You have gone to a great deal of trouble to be believed about a thing nobody here has questioned, and then she asked for the salt, and that was his visit. Marash was away from the table for 3 nights that week. A courier came in off the low road with something green in him, and she took him into the still room and did not come out, and the food the kitchen sent in came back out untouched. On the 3rd evening, Barrow said the order, and in the middle of it, he said the man sits 4th tonight, above Marash. I said, no. The whole hall heard me. I had not planned it, and I was not making any kind of point. And if you had asked me at the time, I would have said I was correcting a clerical error. I said, Marash has not slept in 3 days, and she is downstairs with her hands inside a man from the low road. And if there is a seat going tonight, it is hers, and I will take whatever is left over after that. Barrow said, the man refuses the announced place. Then he said, the refusal of an announced place costs 2. 6th, then he asked whether the house was ready for the bread. The hall made a sound I had never heard out of it before. It was not approval, and it was not shock. It was a room full of people who have just watched a thing they will still be arguing about in a year, and it went on long enough that Barrow had to wait it out before he could get to who does not eat what. I sat down at 6th and ate my dinner, and was certain I had made a fool of myself in front of the lot of them, which is what a man thinks when he has just done the only thing any of them had ever seen anybody do. Arash came up 2 hours later, gray to the lips, and found her place laid at 4th, with the food still hot under a cloth, because I had put it there before I sat down. She stood and looked at the cloth for a while. She said, who did this? I said, the kitchen. She said, the kitchen is asleep. I said, then it must have been me, and she said, yes, it must, and sat down and ate everything on the plate without once checking any of it, and she has never mentioned it since, and neither have I. Sevka told me afterwards what had happened at the head of the table while I was arguing about a chair. She said Kadrish put her cup down and watched me all through it without looking away once, and that in 200 years she had not seen that woman look at anything for that long. I did not understand it then, and I will say it plainly now, because it is the hinge of everything that came after. Every person at that table had spent a long life moving a chair towards the top of the room. I was the first one she had ever watched move a chair away from himself. She said nothing to me about it, then or ever, in those words. What she did instead was ask me a question. It came at the end of that same meal, when she said, the low road. What do you think? And the hall went quiet, because Iron Volk has held a gate on the low road for 40 years and was sitting 4 places up with her spoon in the air. I said, I think the low road is where the couriers are getting poisoned. I said, whatever is being carried on, it is worth more than the men carrying it, because nobody poisons a man for what is in his pockets. Then I said, but I have not been on it. And Iran Volk has. Kadresh said, I know. I asked you. At the next meal, she asked me about the Western Pass before she asked Sevka, and at the one after that, about the kitchen debt to the Low Farms. And after that, it was simply how the house ran, and I stopped being able to tell you the date it began. Barrow folded it into the order inside a week. He says, the crown asks the man first. He says it in the same voice as the fish. He has never let on that anything in that house had changed, and something had. The court noticed out loud, because that is the only way anything is ever noticed there. One of the ancients announced at the table in front of me that the crown had asked the man first, on 9 days out of 9, and that he had been keeping count on purpose. Halva stood up and announced she would meet anybody in the yard who wished to suggest that the crown's asking was a matter of convenience. Nobody wished to suggest it. She stood with her hand on her bell, looking round that table for one single doubter, could not find one, and had to sit down again. She said into her plate that this house was becoming impossible to live in, and Sevka said from 2 places down that she had been saying so since the boots. Then the 5 of them fell to arguing about which of them had known first that I would give the seat back. Halva claimed it from the day of the bell. Sevka claimed it from the boots. Isolde said she had known in my 2nd week and could give the hour. Iren Volk hummed and said she had known on the day of the gate, because a man who wedges a door for the convenience of a woman he does not work for will not take a chair off a woman with her hands in a courier. Barrow settled it out loud, by time, as he settles everything, and he found against 2 of them and gave it to Iren Volk, and said the 9th hour of the day of the gate was the earliest claim on the record of the house. Iren Volk did not smile. She took out the knotted cord, measured the door frame of the hall, compared it against a knot she had put in that cord in the spring, said, he has grown, and sat down and finished her dinner. Voss went home the next morning and would not take breakfast at the table. Vale stayed an hour longer, and I was in the yard with 2 buckets when the master got up on his horse, and he was not saying anything about ropes at all. He said, 5 months, and what you have brought me back is a stool. Isolde came into the kitchen that night while I was scouring the big pot and stood there until I looked up. She said, the Crowns have started asking about you. I said, asking what? She said, who sits at the ash table with no family name behind him, and where he came from, and why the ash crown asks him first. Then she took the dry flower from behind her ear and put a different one there and said, 900 mouths, and not one of them mine, and went out and left me standing with my arms in the water. Sevka's riders came in off the pass in the 8th month with their boots ruined, 40 pairs of them, wet through and split along the welt where the salt gets in, and I sat up with them. It is not difficult work, it is only long. You dry them slowly or you cook the leather, so you sit by a low fire and turn them and grease them and stitch what has gone, and you go on doing that for as many hours as there are boots. I had them back outside the barrack door in pairs before the light came, because 40 men hunting for their own boots in a heap is how a morning gets lost. Then I went and lit the kitchen fires, because that is what happens at that hour whatever else has happened. The riders decided the house had done it. One of them said out loud in the yard that the ash court looks after its own, and another said that at his last posting, they had taken a month off his pay for a set of laces, and a third one said he was keeping the left boot because it had never fitted him until now. Sevka stood up at the meal that night before the soup was down. She said, the man sits above me. 40 pairs done between the last hour and the first, and he told nobody, and I only know because I went out early and stood in my own doorway, like an idiot wondering who had been at my door in the night. Barrow said, 5th, and asked whether anybody was waiting on the bread. 2 people were waiting on the bread. It was the last good meal I had for some while. Anakorin, Vel, came back on the 4th day of that week with nothing in his hands and a different face on him. He did not ask for anything. He did not bring anybody with him. He came in, took the seat at the unfinished end before he was told to, and ate his first dish like a man at his own table. That should have warned me. 8 months of watching him arrive with the demand and leave without it had taught me his shape, and this was not his shape. He waited for the hall to fill. He waited through the first dish and let the noise come up in the room. Then he set his spoon down and said, may I say one thing to this house? And Barrow said the house was eating, which is not a refusal, and Vale said it anyway. He said, you keep him out of pity. Then he waited, because he had worked out that in a room where nobody may explain anything, a pause does the work of an argument. He said, I have watched this table for 8 months. I have watched him carry and mend and cook and stand about with a jug in each hand. He has ended no war. He has held no gate. He commands nothing, he owns nothing, and he does not do one thing in a day that a good servant does not do better. He said, and every one of you knows it. You have made a pet of a boy who fell down a hole, and you have given the pet a chair, and in my house we would call that charity, and we would have the decency to call it that out loud. And he sat down and finished his fish, and nobody said anything at all. And the only movement in that hall was a girl of about 14, going along the far wall with a jug, because nobody had told her to stop. Halva came up off the bench, with her mouth already open. She got as far as, that man is, and Barrow said, from the doorway, in the voice he uses for the fish, that the house would remind the general what the next words cost. She stood there. You could watch her go through it. She has fought 60 duels, and she could not finish a sentence in her own hall, and she sat down, and the bell at her wrist went on ringing for a while afterwards in the quiet, which was the only sound in the room. Ebiumas alles eis. I have thought about that quiet more than about anything else that happened to me at that court. I counted it out afterwards against how a man counts when he is waiting to be told something. It ran about 10 seconds. That is nothing at all until you are standing in the middle of it with a jug. Aaron Volk did not hum. Isolde, who has an answer to everything and 900 mouths to put it in, looked at the tablecloth. Mirage turned her glass round twice and did not tap it. And I understood, standing there in the middle of the floor, that not one of them was going to speak. The trap took me the rest of that night to see whole. To answer him, they would have had to say what I was to them. Saying what I am to that house, with me in the room, is explaining a man his own place, and it takes the chair out from under whoever says it. The one sentence that would have knocked Corinvale flat was the one sentence nobody there was allowed to say while I was standing in the room, and I was standing in the room, because I was the one pouring the water. So the quiet held, and while it held, it looked exactly like agreement. It looked that way to me as well, and I was the person it was about. Barrow announced the third dish. He announced it in the ordinary voice, into the middle of the worst silence that Hall had produced in 200 years, and he did not find the silence worth remarking on. And I have never been so grateful to any man for being dull. I put the jug down on the sideboard and walked out, and I did it quietly, the way you leave a room where somebody is sleeping, because I did not want anybody to think I was making an answer of it. Nobody called after me. I went down the passage and through the door and picked up the pot I had left soaking, and that was the first place I ever lost in that house, and nobody took it off me. I stood up and carried it out myself, past 9 people who let me go. Kitchen was glad to see me, and that is what I could not take. They asked me nothing. The head cook shifted along the bench as you do for somebody back from an errand, put the worst job in the room in front of me, which is the grease trap, and said the boy had been at it badly for a month. The senior of the guardroom came to the door about midnight for the thin soup, saw me on my knees at the trap, and said nothing whatsoever about it. He held out his bowl, and I filled it, and he took it away, and he came back the next night and the night after that at the same hour. I stood there with my arms in the grease and thought, this is where I belong, and I have known it since the first week. And tonight the whole house upstairs finally agreed with me, and it will be easier from tomorrow. Sevka came down about an hour later. She came down the kitchen stair, which generals do not use, and sat on the flour bin and said, Del once, what she does when she is about to spend something, and then looked at me for a while without saying anything, which for her is an ordeal. She said, I am going to lose my seat for this. Then she said, you are not the kitchen. You are the second person in this house. When she wants to know what a room thinks, she asks you before she asks me, and I have 11 battles behind me and you have a mop. She said, that man tonight was talking about a servant, and there is no servant here. There is you, and there is what you are, and you have carried her things since your first month. And not one person at that table can tell you what that means without going to the bottom of it. And so I am telling you. I said the soup would go cold if she sat on the flour. That is the worst thing I did in all that year. She told me the plain truth in plain words with her own place on the fire. And I heard a general being kind to a kitchen boy who had been called a charity case in front of the house 4 hours earlier. I said, you are good to say it. I said, I know what I am and I have always known, and it is no bad thing to be. I said, go up before Barrow gets to the fish. She looked at me a long time. Then she went up and I turned back to the trap and felt better, and that is the whole shape of it. The truth was said out loud in that kitchen, and it did not take, because I had already settled what I was, and a man who is settled that cannot be reached by anybody at all. I chose to instapis. Banjikai was not in that hall the next evening. I had it from the girl who carries the jugs, who did not know she was telling me anything at all. Barrow called the places, first name to last, on one breath, as he has every day for 200 years. Iron Volk, Halva, Isolde, Mirash, the 3 who predate the generals, and then Sevka at the bottom of it, which had never happened in the memory of anybody there. There was no 9th name. There was no man in it at all. The order simply stopped, and the house sat down. Sevka carried her cup the length of that table, and sat at the rough end of it next to Corin Vale, and Vale had the sense not to look at her. One of the old ones asked her quietly what she had done, and she said, I explained something to somebody. Nobody asked her anything further, because everybody there knew the tariff. The old man filled her cup for her, which is as near as that house comes to putting a hand on a shoulder. Vale looked down the table at the empty place at the end of it, and went on looking, and he was the only person in the room who did. Kadresh came to the kitchen that night, and what she did not do is the whole of her, so I will say it first. She did not send for me. She did not have Barrow put the number back. She did not tell me what I was, because of every person in that house, she was the one who could not. She came down the stair in the dark and stood on the far side of the block while I banked the fire and said, why did you not argue? I said, because he was right. She said, in what way was he right? I said, I fell down a hole. I have not held a gate or ended a war. I did nothing today a good servant would not have done better, and I have eaten at your table for 8 months without once being able to say what I am for. When a man has it right in a full room, arguing only asks the room to be polite. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and if the room had not been polite, what did you think it would have said? I said that he was right. She said, that is what I thought you thought. And something went out of her voice on the last word of it, that I did not hear at the time and have heard every time I have gone over it since. Then she went back up the stair. I banked the fire and lay down where the kitchen sleeps and did not sleep at all. And upstairs, for the first time since the night they carried me in, nobody had been named at the bottom of the order. Barrow put me back at ninth the next evening and did not look up while he did it. He said the order from the top, Sevka was in her own place again. The man was at the bottom of it, and nobody said one word about the night before. I stood waiting for somebody to mention it, which is like waiting for a wall. That is how the year turned. I had been in that house 11 months, and I had gone from the bottom to fifth and back to the bottom, and the only thing anybody had explained to me in all that time was where the vinegar was kept. Cora and Avel came up the west road in the last week of it with a cauldron on a cart, and the guardroom had word of it a full hour before the hall did, because the guardroom always does. It was a good cauldron with good food in it. Mutton, barley, fat on the top, enough for 30. He did not bring it to the hall. He took it to the guardroom by the west gate, which was the cleverest thing he had done since the horse, and had it set on their own stove while they watched. He made a short speech about how the guild valued the men who kept the roads open, and how a house that fed you was a house worth being on good terms with. The senior of them heard him out. Then he said, "That is very fine," and thanked him properly, and asked whether the master would take a bowl of theirs first, since a man should know what he is being compared against. Vale said he had eaten. The senior said it was no trouble at all, and one of them was already filling a bowl, and it was thin soup because it was always thin soup, because it is what is left when the good of the pot has gone up to the table. He gave it to Vale with both hands, the way you hand a thing to somebody you respect. Then the whole room stopped what it was doing and waited, with the friendliest faces you ever saw in your life, to Friesian when Rowan chain line to hear which of the two he preferred. Vale ate the thin soup standing up. Then he said it was very good, and the senior said yes, and went back to his crate. They ate the mutton. They ate every scrap, and were glad of it, and talked about it for a week. It changed nothing at all, and Vale rode away understanding that in that guardroom, a bowl of hot water with a bone through it outranked mutton, because of who had carried it up there at midnight for a year. He came to the hall the next day and demanded a duel, and he did it properly, which I will give him. He came to the middle of the floor, said his own name and his office and his house, and said he required satisfaction of the man for the injury done to the standing of his house. Alva was on her feet before Barrow could open his mouth, and she was so happy she could hardly get the words out in order. She said, "You may not challenge him," she said. "The list of people who may challenge a man at this table is short, and I know it, because I keep it, and I have kept it for 60 duels. You must be seated at this table, or seated at a table that this table recognizes, or you must have been thrown out by your own people, which is the same as being seated in the opinion of anybody who matters." Vale said, "I sit at this table." Halva said, "You sit at the end of it, on the unfinished wood, by the courtesy of a house you have insulted twice, and that is not the same, and you know it is not the same." Then she offered him a way in, because she is generous when it costs her nothing. She said, "I will put you on the list myself tonight if you will stand up in this hall and tell us the name of the man who tried to kill you." Vale said nothing, because nobody had ever tried to kill Corin Vale. Everybody there had been thrown away by somebody. He was the only man in the room who had always been perfectly safe among his own, and in that house it made him nobody. Halva sat down, took the banner out, and began stitching, and said, without looking up, that the offer stayed open all year. The great meal of the year fell on the 9th day after that. It is the one meal the Ash Court does properly, and the kitchen begins on it 4 days out, and it is the only night of the year when the fires all go at once. 2 of the kitchen went down with a fever on the 2nd day. The head cook went down on the 3rd. That left the boy, 2 girls who had never worked a big fire, and me. So I cooked it. I did not think anything of it at the time, and everything afterwards turns on that. I had been cooking in that kitchen for 11 months. It was the work I believed I had been hired to do. There was a meal to get up and no one else to get it up, so I got it up. I did all of it. I did the birds and the roots and the black bread and the sauce that Irinvolk will eat and the one without vinegar that she will not. And I did a dish of white beans the way my mother did them, because there were beans and there was time and my hands were doing it before I decided anything. I sent it up. I stood at the passage door with a towel over my shoulder to watch the plates go out, which is the only reason anybody cooks anything, and I heard the hall go quiet, which a hall only does when the food is right. Mirage found it first. She had a mouthful of the beans and she stopped with the spoon still up, and she looked down the length of that table at the passage door, where I was standing with the towel. She got up so fast that her chair went over. She said, "The man sits above me. I have eaten in this hall for 140 years, and I know every hand that has cooked in it, and I do not know this hand, and it is not in the kitchen, because the kitchen is in bed with a fever." Irin Volk stood up while Marash was still talking. She hummed once and said it too. "The man sits above me." She said, "The beans have no vinegar in them, and I have not asked anybody for that in 40 years, and nobody has ever asked me why." Isolde stood up third. She had not stood for anybody in all that year, and she had been keeping it, and she spent it here. She said it third, "The man sits above me, and I have known it since his second week, and I have said nothing because it was not mine to say, and I am done with saying nothing." Halva was up before Isolde had finished, talking over her, saying, "The man sits above me, and I said so first." And Barrow said, "You did not." Sevka never stood at all, because Sevka had got up when Marash's chair went over and never sat back down, and she was standing at the top of the table with her arms folded, looking at the whole of it like a woman watching a slow horse finally come in. And then the three of them who were here before the generals stood up, one after another, and put their hands on the backs of their chairs. That is what did it. Those three had sat at that table since before there were generals to sit under. They had never risen for anybody, not for Sevka after her 11 battles, not for Irin Volk and her gate. They got up one after another, and the last of them said only, "The man sits above me, because the beans are how my mother made them, and I have not eaten them since she died." Barrow made them do it in order. He stood in the doorway and established, out loud, in front of the whole house, who had risen earliest, and he found against two of them. And there was a dispute about whether Marash's chair going over counted as rising, which he settled by saying that a chair is not a person. They argued about it. They interrupted each other to argue about it. 5 generals and 3 ancients of the Ash Court fell over one another, trying to prove they had been the one to see it soonest, because at that table being second to notice is the only thing that stings. Then Barrow turned to the room and said the order straight down the table on a single breath, as he says it every evening of his life. And this time it began with the man. First, he said it as flatly as he announces the fish. The hall stood up, all of it, the table and the sideboards and the 2 girls at the passage door, and the guardroom men who had come in for the year meal and were standing along the back wall, and they stood as a room stands when it has been waiting a long time to be allowed to. I stood in the doorway with a towel over my shoulder and my hands still wet, and I understood where I was. I want to be careful here, because this is the only place in any of it where I have nothing funny to say. I had spent a year in that house believing I was the porter and the kitchen hand. I had carried her things and thought it was carrying. I had mended a door and thought it was a door. Every one of them had known from the first week. Not one of them had been able to tell me, because telling me would have cost them the chair, and they had gone on hinting harder and harder for 11 months, while I thanked them and went back down to the grease trap. The whole year turned over in my head in about the time it takes to put a towel down, and every kindness I had misread came back through in order, and it was a long list, and I was still holding a ladle at the end of it. Cursed ones, Entienne. Kadresh did not explain it either. She could not. And she is the last person in that hall who could have. She waited until the room sat, and she looked at me down the length of it, and she said one thing. She said, "Everybody at this table is here because somebody tried to kill them. I made that rule myself 200 years ago, and I have never once been able to find out what any of them would do if I unmade it." Nobody answered her. Barrow announced the second dish, which was mine, and the hall ate it in the strangest quiet I have ever stood in. The messenger came in on the horse Vale had given Sevka, because it was the fastest thing in the yard, and nobody had found any other use for it. He came from the low road, and he had ridden 2 days. He said the crowns of the continent were gathering. He said they had not gathered in 90 years, and that this time the gathering had a subject, and that he had been told not to say the subject in a hall with a stranger in it. Everybody in that hall looked at the man sitting first, who was me, and I looked back at them, and for the first time in my life, I understood a look before it was explained to me. Isolde took the flower from behind her ear and put a different one there. Somebody asked her what that one meant. She said, "I am not going to tell you," and it was the first time in a year anybody had heard her decline to say anything at all. Barrow came to the doorway to close the evening. He said the house would be quiet from the 9th hour. He said, "Who does not eat what?" Then he said that at the next great meal, there would be 9 chairs at that table and one more besides, because somebody was bringing her own. For 11 days after they made me first, I was the worst man in that house to be anywhere near. I had been told at last what I was, and I did what anybody does when he is handed a thing he did not earn and cannot give back. I tried to do it correctly. I stopped going through doors and began arriving at them. I paused. I announced myself out loud in my own kitchen to 2 girls who had known me a year and had watched me sleep on the floor by the fire. I put my coat on to carry a jug. I said the word crown out loud in a sentence at a table to a woman I had been calling Kadresh since my 2nd week, and she set her cup down and looked at me the way you look at a dog that has started walking on its back legs. Sevka got me in the passage on the 4th day and put me into the wall with the flat of her hand. She said, "Stop it." I said, "Stop what?" She said, "You have gone stiff. You go about this house like a man delivering something." Then she said, "Do you know what you sound like? You sound like him. You sound like the man at the bottom of the table with the hat in his hands." That landed harder than anything Karanvale managed in 2 years. I said, "I am only trying to do it properly." She said, "You were doing it properly." Then she took the jug off me, drank out of it, gave it back, and went away down the passage without another word. The other thing I did was worse. Once I understood that carrying her things was an honor and not a chore, I did the natural thing with an honor, which is to hand it to somebody who has earned it more than you have. On the 6th morning, I picked up her load, took it out to the yard, and offered it to Sevka. I said it kindly. I said, "You have 11 battles behind you, and I have a mop, and this ought to have been yours for 100 years. The yard emptied. I have never seen anything like it before or since. 2 stable hands went indoors. A girl carrying eggs turned round and walked back the way she had come, still carrying the eggs, and did not come out again until the middle of the afternoon. Sevka did not take the load. She put both hands behind her back like a child at a stall and said, "Do not do this to me," and there was real fright in it, from a woman who has ridden at a wall of shields for a living. Halva heard about it before I got back to the door, and she was angrier than she had been all year, duel and all. She said, "You offered it away, in this house that is worse than dropping it, because dropping a thing is only an accident." Mirash arrived at speed with her spoon in her fist, asked whether I had a fever, and was extremely put out to find that I did not. Irenvolk hummed for a long while before she said anything, and then she said only, "No," and stood there until I picked it up again. Barrow came out into the yard, said in his ordinary voice that the man carries her things, did not raise his eyes from the step he was crossing, and went on into the house. So I picked the load back up, and I have carried it ever since, and I never offered it to anybody again. I understood a week later why it had frightened Sevka. At that court, a thing you are given is a thing somebody chose you for, and handing it on says out loud that the choosing was a mistake. What was said on the North Road that week I had afterwards from the herald himself, who told the guardroom, who told the kitchen, who told me, and it went like this. The elder crown travels with her own chair on a cart. It is an ugly old thing, black wood, worn pale on the arms, and it goes ahead of her, under a cloth with 2 men to lift it down. Her herald asked why they were going north at her age in that weather. Yasavet said, 200 years ago, a girl came and asked leave to write a rule for her own house, and the rule was that she would take nobody who had not been thrown away by their own people. I told her it was pretty and let her write it. The herald said, "And now," she said, "now there is a human being sitting at the top of that table. Every crown on this continent has heard of it, and I have come to see what my pretty rule has grown into." Then she said, "And I would like to look at him." The chair arrived a day and a half before she did. 2 men brought it in on their shoulders, set it at the table, took the cloth off it, and went away without eating. It sat there empty through 2 meals. And Barrow, who was not going to be moved by any of it, said the order both times, with a place in it for a woman who was not in the building. He said it in the tone he keeps for announcing a dish. The chair had a place at that table before the woman had a face. She came in on the 2nd evening. She did not wait to be met or announced or offered anything at all. She crossed the hall while the first dish was going round, sat down in her own chair, and the whole table came up onto its feet, and she said, "Sit." And it sat. She is old the way stone is old. She is not frail, and she is not grand. She looks like somebody's grandmother who has buried 2 of her own children and has no intention of discussing it with you. She spoke to Kadresh as you speak to a younger woman who has done the thing you warned her about. She said, "You have gone gray about the eyes. You are not eating. I told you that rule of yours would turn out to be a door and not a wall, And here we both are. 200 years crowned, 5 generals, 9 crowns of the continent reckoning themselves against her. And Kadresh sat and took it with her hands in her lap, and I stood behind her chair with a jug and learned something about the size of the world. Then Yasavet turned round and spoke to me. She said, "You are the porter." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you know why I have come?" I said, "No." She said, "Good. At least one person in this room is not pretending." Then she asked what the roads were like up from the low farms, and I told her, and she listened to the whole answer, and asked whether the ford bridge had been mended, and I said it had not. And she said, "That is what I thought." I had been in that house a year and 1 month. Every soul in it had spent that year hinting at me sideways, because the plain words would have cost them their chairs. An old woman asked me plain questions and waited for plain answers, and I did not know where to put my hands. Vale ruined his own evening about a quarter of an hour in. She had not asked him anything. She had not looked at him once. He stood up at the bottom end of that table and said that the Iron Lantern welcomed the Elder Crown and stood ready to assist her in the matter before the house. Yasavet did not turn her head. She said, "What is that?" Halva said, "From 4 places up, that is the rope." The whole table said it back like a response in a service. It was not arranged. Sevka said it, then one of the old ones, then Mirash, and Barrow said at the end of it, in the flattest voice on this continent, that the guild sends the rope and the rope sits at the bottom. It was the rope from that evening onward. Nobody at that court used his name again where I could hear it, and by the end of the following month, nobody on the continent did either, and I have since heard a boy selling apples 4 days from there call him the rope without knowing there had ever been another word for him. Then she came to it, and there was no paper and no reading out and no ceremony of any kind about it. There was an old woman with a plate in front of her and a room that had stopped chewing. She said, "The law of the 9 crowns is that a crown holds what its own people will sit down under." She said, "You have a man at that table, not a servant, not a soldier, not a hostage. A man, first in the order, and nobody on this continent can tell me what he is." She said, "So it comes apart into 2 things, and you may have either one. The man leaves the table, or the crown comes off you and goes back to the 9 to be argued over." Nobody ate anything. Irin Volk stopped with the bread halfway up. Adresh said, "And if I do neither?" Yasavet said, "Then you will ride your own holdings and be seated by every house that still calls you crown, and you will do it with him at your back where they can all see him. And at the end of it, the 9 will count who sat you and who did not. I have brought my chair. I mean to watch the whole of it." Iron Folk said, out loud, without being asked, that there were 11 houses that mattered, and 4 that would be difficult. Nobody told her to be quiet. Barrow wrote nothing down and said the second dish was ready. Then Yasavet looked down the table at me and said the thing that was the actual point of her coming, and she said it kindly, which made it a good deal worse. She said, "Boy, you are nothing. That is not an insult. There is no place for you in the law that made this house. No crown on this continent has a word for what you are, and when we come to count, you will not be in the count." I said, "How much am I carrying?" She stopped. It is the only time I ever saw her stop. She said, "What?" I said, "On the road. If she rides with a porter, because somebody has to carry it, and I am the porter." I said I would want the number of days, and whether we were going by the low farms, because it changes what you take, and it changes the boots. The hall went off like a dropped tray. Halva hit the table with the flat of her hand twice. Sevka put her head back and laughed at the roof beams. "Watch your tricks, Voinces." Barrow announced the second dish and then announced who does not eat lily root, and the meal went on around her. The Elder Crown sat through all of it looking at me with an expression I could not read at the time. Afterwards, in the passage, she stopped me with a hand on my sleeve and said, "They have not told you what you are, have they?" I said, "They told me last month." She said, "No. They told you where you sit." Her chair went back onto the cart in the morning. She came out to watch it loaded herself and stood in the yard with her hood up while they roped it down, and I brought the ropes because I was the one who knew the knot. She said, "The first house we come to will not know you at all. No order, no number, no year of carrying anybody's bag. They will look at you and see a human being in a bad coat." Then she said she was extremely interested to see where I would sit. On a road, the order of places is not said by a butler. It is said by the driver, and it goes by wheels. I did not know that when we set out. I found out on the first morning, when the old man on the box called it over his shoulder without turning round, in exactly the dead voice Barrow uses, and I understood that this is not an Ash Court custom at all. It is what everybody does. I had simply never been anywhere. The front left wheel is the place. The front right is second. Then the two back wheels, then the ones walking in the ruts behind the cart, and then whoever is at the tail of it eating the dust of the whole procession. He put Halva at the front left because of the banner. He put Aaron Volk at the front right because she is the heaviest and the cart runs better with her weight on that side, which is the actual reason for the entire custom, and nobody in 900 years has admitted it out loud. He put the porter at the tail. 12 days, and I spent all of them looking at the back of my own household from a distance of about 30 feet. Sevka dropped back twice on the second day to walk with me, and the driver called her forward both times. On that road, a driver outranks a general, and she went, and the second time she went, she said something about wheels that I will not repeat. Alva rode the whole first week under the banner in the rain, upright, streaming, because a banner in the rain is a banner that is being looked at. By the fourth day, the dye had gone through the cloth, and she had a green neck, and she would not discuss it, and nobody was brave enough to raise it. Mirage tasted everything at every inn before anybody else touched it, including the water, and told two innkeepers on the low road precisely what was wrong with their cooking. Both of them thanked her. That is the effect she has on people, and she has never once noticed it. On the sixth day, Kadresh sent the cart on ahead and rode at the back with me, and I need to say plainly that this was not a thing that happened. She had ridden with generals and with heralds and with nobody at all. In 14 months, I had never once been alone with her outside a kitchen. She held her horse back until the tail of the column caught up, and then we were walking together in the dust with the household a quarter mile in front. She let it run for about an hour. Then she said, I want to ask you a thing I have not asked anybody in 200 years, because there has never been anybody I could ask. I said, all right. She said, what is it like, being thrown away by your own people? Then she said, I have built a house out of people it happened to, and I have never once had the manners to ask a single one of them. I thought about it for a while, because the question deserved that, and then I told her what I have, which is not much and is at least mine. I said, the falling is nothing. The falling takes no time, and you are busy. What it is like comes afterwards, and it is this. Before it happens, you have about 40 people you would have called yours. Afterwards, you know the number exactly, and it is smaller, and you did not get to choose which ones. She said, and is that better or worse? I said, it is better. It is horrible, and it is better. Nobody who has never been dropped knows one true thing about who is standing near them. She said nothing at all for about a mile. Then she said, I made a law 200 years ago that fills my table with people it happened to, and I am the only one sitting at it who has not been dropped. Then she rode forward to the cart. I walked. A month later, I worked out what I had just told the most powerful woman on this continent, which is that she had built herself a house she was not able to test. The first foreign hall came on the 11th day, a stone place above the ford, and the man who owned it had 30 riders and a good roof, and no idea in the world who I was. Asavet had been right, and she had been right on purpose. There was no order in that hall with my number in it, and no year of carrying anybody's bag. There was a household coming in out of the wet, a steward with a list in his head, and a human being in a bad coat standing behind a queen. I could see him working it out. It was going to be somewhere near the door, and it was going to be said out loud in front of my own household, because that is how it is done everywhere. And Iron Volk had gone very still, and Sevka had her mouth open again. Neither of them could say one word. Saying it would have been explaining a man his place, and the tariff for that does not stop at the border of the Ash March, and both of them knew it. And Yasavet sat and watched them know it. So I went and sat down before he could get to me, and I did it at a walk, without hurrying, because a man who hurries into the worst seat in a room looks like a man making a point about something. There is a bench by the door in that hall where the kennelmen sit, because the dogs come in with the weather, and somebody has to be near them. I sat on the end of it, below the kennelman, which is the lowest seat in the building, and put my hands on my knees and waited for the food like everybody else. The steward stopped with his mouth open. I had taken it off him. A man cannot put you below the dogs if you are already sitting there, and there is no ceremony anywhere on this continent for a guest who seats himself last. Yasavet, from 4 places up and dry as a stick, said, Endito unchuro antuwar intuai. Well, then she went back to her plate, and prasputur as chaintuan toai. And Kadresh did not look at me once for the rest of that meal, which I took at the time to mean she was ashamed of me. The kennelmen were pleased, which nobody had allowed for. One of them shifted his coat off the bench to make room and told me at length about a bitch of his that would not whelp. and I told him what my mother used to do about that. And before the first dish was done, there were 3 of them leaning in over the table. Corin Vale had ridden with the column the whole way, because the guild had told him not to let me out of his sight, and at that hall, he made the only move left to him, and it was the wrong one. He went to the steward and said that, as the envoy of the Iron Lantern, he ought to be seated above the porter. The steward heard him out. Then he said, in front of about 60 people, that the house had already placed him, that a guest who asks to be moved up is telling his host he has been insulted, and that this house would sooner insult a man properly than be accused of doing it by halves. Then he moved Vale down too, to the wet end where the draft comes under the door, and put him below the kennelman as well. So the 2 of us sat on the dog bench together for the whole of that meal, and he did not say one word to me. I passed him the bread, and he took it. Somewhere in the middle of the second dish, one of the dogs put its head in his lap and would not be shifted, and he sat with his hand held up in the air, not touching it, for a good long while. Sevka watched that from the high table with her chin on her fist and did not blink, and afterwards she said it was the best thing she had seen since the water butt. Then the host asked the question, down the length of the hall, loudly, in the manner of a man who has been drinking and wants an answer he can repeat to people. He said, "Who is the one on the dog bench?" Hall went quiet. Every soul in my household knew exactly what I was, and I could feel the lot of them willing me to say something large. I said, "My name is Dell, and I am a human being out of the Low Country. I was a porter of the Iron Lantern for 2 seasons, and I am the porter of the Ash Crown now." Somebody laughed. The host did not. He put his cup down and looked at me for a while, and then he said, so that his own hall heard it, "Move him up." They asked him why, because in that house the reason is said out loud as well. He said, "I have 11 men at this table who have told me tonight what they are, and everyone made it bigger than it was. That one made it smaller, and it is still true. And I have not had that here since my father died." They took me up the length of the hall, past 30 riders, and put me at the 3rd table, and the kennelman I had been talking to told everybody within reach that he and I were acquainted. And before the night was out, he had told it to my own generals. That was where I understood what this road was going to be. Every hall would start me at the bottom. The number would mean nothing when I walked in. The only thing traveling with me was what I actually did once I was in the room. Yasevet found me afterwards in the yard, going over the harness, because the near side trace had been rubbing all day, and somebody had to see to it before morning. She said, "Why did you not tell him you sit first at the ash table?" I said, "Because I do not, in his house." She said, "That is a convenient answer. Have you a better one?" I said, "No," and she said, "Good," and stood there while I worked. Then she asked me something else. Slowly, the way you put a foot on ice. She said, "Do you want that seat? The one at the top of that table. Do you want it, or do you only take it when it is handed to you?" I said I had never once thought about it, and I stood there with a strap in my hand, and found out while I was saying it that it was perfectly true. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I have asked people questions for 1100 years, and I have known the answer before I opened my mouth every single time but 4. She said it the way a woman reads out a fault in her own roof, and went in out of the cold without saying goodnight. The messenger came in at the end of the 12th day on a lathered horse from the western gate, and he would not say it in the hall. He said it in the yard to Irenfolk with 4 of us standing round, and he said the garrison at her gate had shut it and would not open, and had sent word down the pass to say why. He said, "They will not open for a crown that travels with a human." Adaskorpras et befer. Innocent seat by the western gate of the Ash March is 2 leaves of oak the height of 4 men, and Iron Volk has stood at it for 40 years, and when we came up the pass it was shut against her. She got down off the cart and looked at it for a long time. The garrison were up on the wall. Nobody threw anything and nobody shouted, which somehow made it worse. And Halva had the banner out and up before anybody asked her to. I said the only thing I could think of, which was that it was a poor way to treat her after 40 years. She hummed, and then she said the thing I have carried about with me ever since. She said, "They are not wrong." She said, "If I were up on that wall and a crown came up this road with a human walking behind it, I would have shut it too, and I would have been sure I was doing my work." Then she took out the knotted cord and began measuring the gate, from the ground to the hinge, from the hinge to the top, and writing nothing down anywhere, and she went on doing that for most of the afternoon, while 40 men watched her from the wall and got quieter. Sevka wanted to go up the rock face at the north end and open it from inside. Halva wanted a challenge, cried up at the wall by name. Mirage said, without looking up from her bag, that there were 3 ways into any garrison, and that 2 of them were the well and the food. Folk said, no. She said, a gate you break is a gate you have to hold afterwards. Then she measured the same wall again. She waits better than anything alive, and she has had 40 years of practice at that particular spot. I went and found the corner where the smoke was coming out and shouted up and asked who was cooking today. There was a long pause. Then a voice came back over the wall and said, Reckon is cooking. I said, is Reckon the one who puts the barley in early? The voice said, he is. And then it said, how do you know that? In the tone of a man who has said more than he intended. I said we had come up from the low farms and had 4 sacks of roots and a side of bacon that would not keep another day, and that it seemed a shame to have it go over with us to the wrong side of a shut gate. Then I put the whole of it in a basket and sent it up on their own rope. I did not do it as a move. I have been asked since whether it was a move by people who were extremely pleased with me, and I have to keep saying that there was food going off in a cart and 40 men behind a wall who had been eating salt meat for 9 days. The gate opened at the 4th hour of the morning, and it was opened by one man on his own, working the bar back by himself in the dark while 39 others lay listening to him do it. He came out and stood in front of Iron Volk and said, I am the first. Then he said, I want that in front of everybody. I am the first, and I am saying it out loud, and the rest of them can be second. Nobody there thought that was strange except me. He had lain awake all night doing arithmetic about which of 40 men was going to be last, and somewhere before dawn he had decided it was not going to be him. The rest of the garrison came out of that gate at a run. There was a bad half hour where 9 of them tried to say it at once, and Iren Volk had to stand there and be told 9 times that she was owed a gate, and she hummed all the way through it. Corin Vale chose the middle of that morning to produce his proof. That is what he called it, and he had carried it up from the guild in a wrapped cloth for 9 days. He unwrapped it in the gateway in front of the garrison and my household and the elder crown, and it was a length of rope, frayed at the end, opened out into a brush as old rope does when it lets go. He held it up and said, this is what happens to rope, and that a gate had come down because of it. Iren Folk walked over to him. She did not hum, which I noticed at once, because she hums before every word she has ever said to anybody, and there was no sound out of her at all. She took the other end out of her own coat. It had been in the cart the whole way. It is the piece that came up out of the undergate with me, and it does not fray at the end. It is flat, and it is at an angle. And there is one nick where the blade went in and slipped and went in again. She laid it down beside his in the gateway and put a stone on each of them so the wind would not move them, and stood back and did not say one word. 40 men who read rope and stone and timber for a living came and looked at the 2 ends. Nobody argued with him. Nobody shouted. They looked and then went back to whatever they had been doing, one after another, and he was left standing in a gateway with a stone on either side of him. I have thought since that a room turning away is worse than a room turning on you. Turning on you means you are still in the room. That evening I gave Iren Volk a bowl. It was ordinary stew out of the garrison pot, and I put it in her hands. Their cook had my name off me by the afternoon and had taken to shouting Dell down the length of the wall whenever he wanted the roots. She looked at it. Then she said, whose is it? I said, yours. She said, no. Whose is it? Which post? And I said, nobody's. It is just food, and there is more of it, and it is not going anywhere, and nothing is going to happen to it. She held it a while. She has eaten standing at that gate for 40 years, out of a bowl she kept an eye on, because a woman guarding a thing does not put it down. She asked me twice more whether I was certain, then sat on the mounting block and ate it, looking at the wall like a woman at a play. Afterwards she took the cord out, stood me against the gatepost, marked me at the top of the head with her thumbnail, and cut a notch there with her knife. She said, spring, and put the cord away. It is still there. I have been told it is still there. Sevka's camp was 2 days further on, and it does not have a hall or a table or a butler in it. It has a cauldron. The order of places at that camp is the queue, and the cook says it. He said it that evening, standing on a box with a ladle, and he went right down the list of them by name, and there is no shame in the bottom of it, and nobody argues. And I was on the end. I was on the end because the one who cooks eats last, and I had spent the afternoon in the camp kitchen, because that is what my hands do when there is a cauldron in front of them. 400 riders ate first. The last of them waited so I would not eat alone, and then complained about the barley. The next morning I took Sevka's watch. I did not ask her whether I might, because she would have said no, and then it would have been a thing she had refused instead of a thing that had happened. She rides out at the first gray light and has done every day since she was 17. I have got up at that hour my whole life for nothing better than lighting a fire. So I went to the picket line, told her second that the general was not coming, did the round with them, and carried what wanted carrying. Sevka slept until noon. She had not done it once in her life, not once. And when she came out into the daylight with her hair flat on one side, the whole camp saw her do it. Two of her riders said out loud, by the cauldron, that she had gone soft, and that a general who sleeps in is a general who has stopped. They said it as a joke, and it was a joke, and it was also going to be in 900 mouths by the following week, because there is no such thing as a joke in a camp. I put my bucket down and told them what she had done in the 11 days before that one, hour by hour, because I had carried her kit, and I knew. She had slept 4 hours in 11 days and spent one of them holding a cart out of a ditch. I said it to 30 people, and I was not polite. The riders took it well. The cook did not. He came round the cauldron with the ladle and said, "Who argues at my pot?" Then he said, in front of the whole queue, that the man who argues at the pot eats after the pot is finished, and he struck me off the queue for that night, and I ate the scrapings standing up at the 10th hour with the dogs going round my legs. That is the road in one evening. I did the best thing I did in 10 days, and I lost my place for it, and both of those were announced out loud by the same man with the same ladle, and neither of them cancelled the other. Sevka came and stood next to me while I was eating the scrapings. She did not apologize because she has never done that in her life. She took the cracked whistle off her neck and blew it at me. It is the sound she calls the beast with. It goes flat at the end. The beast arrived from the far side of the camp at a speed nobody needed, saw that it was not being called, and stood there looking extremely stupid. Sevka said, "It is broken." I said, "It is not broken." She said, "It is broken," and put it back inside her collar and walked off to shout at somebody about pickets, and I stood there with a bowl of scrapings, and I will tell you plainly that it was the best evening I had on that entire road. Yasevet had watched all of it from a folding chair her herald carries, because the big one is on the cart. She had said very little for 2 days. She said, 11 houses. She said, "You have had 2 of them, and both went your way, and I did not come 400 miles to watch a boy be liked by kennelmen and cooks." Then she changed her own terms in front of everybody. She said, "The last house on this road will be chosen by me." She said, "I will pick one where they know exactly what a human being is, and what one is for, and what is inside one, and then let the porter find somewhere to sit." The rider who came in that night brought her the answer before she had asked for it, which pleased her very much. It was an invitation to the house of the physicians from the order that trained Marash, and Marash read the name of it out loud, and then went and stood outside in the dark for a while on her own. Yasevet chose the last house on that road herself, by the terms she had set out at the camp, and she chose the house of the physicians. She was pleased with herself about it. She said, "They will not be rude to him, and they will not put him by the door." She said, "They will be delighted to see him, and they will know what he is made of, and I should like to watch that." It is the house that trained Marash. It stands on white rock above the river with 400 glass windows, and when the sun is on it, you can see it from an hour's ride away, which is not an accident. Marash said one thing about it on the last morning. While she was folding a shirt she had already folded, she said, "They poisoned me first, to be certain of the dose." Then she said, "And they were right to. If you are going to keep an antidote in a house, you had better find out what it is worth on somebody who matters." Then she went and sat on the cart, and Sevka went and sat with her, and neither of them said anything for 11 miles. At the table of that house, everything is tasted 3 times before it reaches a guest. There is a boy for the first taste and a woman for the second, and the man who cooked it does the third, and they do it in front of you, and they smile the whole way through it, and their good humor is entirely professional. I have stood in a great many rooms since that one, including some where people were deciding what to do about me. That is the only room I have ever wanted to get out of. Marash cooked that evening. She asked to, and they let her, and I do not think she had stood in that kitchen for 100 years. She came out with a dish of it herself and put it in front of me, and the tasting boy came forward with his spoon. I ate it before he got there. I was hungry, and it was in front of me, and it had come out of her hands, and those are all the reasons there were. I did not think about it. I have never thought about it. I put my head down and ate what she had made me, as I have eaten everything she has ever made me, and I was about a third of the way down before I understood that the whole of that hall had stopped. Marash had her hand out. She had not been fast enough, and she is fast. Somebody at the far end said, in a voice like a man reading a bill, that the guest had taken it untasted. I said, "Is there something wrong with it?" Nobody answered me, so I said it was good and asked for more, and I said it to Marash, and I held the bowl out. She sat down next to me. She took my wrist and put 2 fingers on it, and she stayed there with her fingers on my pulse for the rest of that meal, through the second dish and the third, and she did not eat anything herself, and she did not say one word to anybody. The house had to say something. They have a rule about it, as everybody on this continent has a rule about everything, and theirs is that the tasting is the honor of the house, and a guest who refuses it is either an insult or a message. The eldest of them stood up. He was about 90, and he had trained her, and he said the man sat above him tonight, and he said it the way you say a thing that costs you money. He said, "In this house we test, and that is what we are for. We have poisoned our own to be sure of a dose. We called it necessary, and we were not lying." That one ate what she gave him without looking at it in front of all of us, and I have to say out loud that I could not do it. Then he asked her whether her hand was steady these days. She said it was. He said he was glad and sat down, and that was as close as that house came to an apology in 400 years. Afterwards, she took the spoon back off me. I had it in my apron, as I had carried it since the spring, and she held out her hand for it, and I gave it to her, and I thought that was the end of the arrangement. She turned it over twice. Then she gave it back and said, "Keep it." She said, "It is yours now, and it does not go black anymore, because you are the one who goes black now, and you did that tonight in front of my whole house, and I have not decided whether I am going to forgive you." Then she went to bed, and in the morning she was normal, and she has never mentioned any of it since. The second house was 2 days east, and it is Halva's, and I was in it for 4 days, and I was barely in the room for any of what happened. Her people burned her banner. That is her whole telling of it, and she gives it out in one line, at speed, as though it were a thing about the weather. They burned it in the yard so that there would be no banner to carry, because if there is no banner, there is no share of the glory to pay to the woman under it. She has been embroidering the replacement for 60 years. It is not a good banner. The stitching goes uphill on the left side, and there is a horse on it that everybody in that house has agreed to call a horse. A painter came through while we were there. He was a real painter, and he was going south, and he had heard that the banner general was in residence, and he asked to paint her, and Halva said yes before he had finished the sentence. She sat for him for 2 days. She sat in armor she does not wear anymore, with the banner pinned up behind her, and the bell taken off her wrist and put in a drawer, which is the only time in 2 years I have known that bell to be anywhere but on her. The painting was bad. It was not badly painted. He had made her as she looked sitting still, which is a woman of 60 in armor holding her chin up, and what he had left out was the thing she actually is, which is a person who arrives. She stood in front of it with everybody in that house behind her, waiting to be told what to think. Then she challenged him to a duel. The painter said yes. That is what ruined it. He put down his brushes and said he would be honored, that he had never fought anybody in his life, that he was 51 years old and had bad knees, and that he would be at her disposal in the yard in the morning, and would she mind if he sat down until then? Halva could not do anything with that at all. She walked about that house for the rest of the day, looking for somebody to be angry with. She tried Sevka and got laughed at. She tried Irin Volk, who hummed at her. She came into the yard where I was watering and asked me whether I had seen it. I said I had. Then I said the only thing I had to say about it, which is that he had painted her sitting, and that I had never once seen her sitting, and that anybody who had met her would have painted her getting off a horse. She stood there. Then she went and got the painter out of his bed at the 10th hour and had him do it again in the yard with the horse and the banner and the bell back on her wrist. And he worked for 3 days, and it was extremely good, and she cried and denied it and made everybody come and look. The third house is Isolda's, and after 400 glass windows and a hall full of armor, it turns out to be a farm. It is a farm with 900 people on this continent talking into it, and nothing whatever to show for that, because they do not write anything down. There is a kitchen and a long room, and a lot of doors that were open before I got to them. She did not give me a tour. She sat me down at the table with tea, and she paid me, and that is the only way I can put it, because for once nobody in that house needed a thing carried or mended or cooked. She said, 22 houses are talking about you. Then she gave me the names. She said which crowns had asked after me and which had asked about the crown instead, and what shape the telling has when it comes back to her. And it is not the shape of anything that happened. She said, in the west you are a sorcerer who came up out of a hole. In the south you are a hostage. There is a version on the low road in which you are her son by a farmer, which I did not correct, because it is the only one that makes anybody kind. I said, and what am I in your telling? She said, you are a porter and it does me no good at all because nobody repeats it. Then I asked her about the flower. I had wanted to know for a year. I said, what does the one behind your ear mean today? She stopped with the cup up. She said nobody had ever asked her that. Then she took it out and looked at it and said, it means I do not know yet, and put it back in, and said, do not tell anybody I have one of those. What Corin Vale did that week I had from her listeners, and it is the only thing he ever did that worked. He rode ahead of us to one of the 9 crowns and was not let in. The listeners had been there first, and the steward left him standing in the porch, and he stood there long enough to hear the places called through the door, all the way to the bottom, and there was no name in it for him. So he stopped following us. That is all there was to it. He got on his horse and went south, past the halls we were going to, ahead of the road entirely, and at every crown he came to, he said one sentence and rode on. He said, the ash crown keeps a human at her table. He did not argue it. He did not bring the rope. One sentence at 9 doors, and he was ahead of us the whole way, and we were behind him being sat at tables and thinking we were winning. Yasavet did the counting on the last evening. She did it out loud at the table, on her fingers, and she made everybody listen. 11 houses. 9 had seated the crown and named her crown out loud. 2 had not, and one of those 2 had not seated anybody in 9 years, and did not count. She said, by the reckoning of the 9 crowns, she has held it. Then she said, and you have lost the road, and put her hand flat on the table, and nobody at it said anything, because she had just said 2 opposite things in a row, and both of them were true. She said, you have won it hall by hall in front of the people who were in the rooms. There are 9 crowns on this continent, and 8 of them were not in any of those rooms. And what they have is what got to them first. And what got to them first has been on a fast horse for 9 days. The messenger came in before anybody could answer her. He came from the Ash March, and he had killed a horse doing it, and he did not wait to be asked. He said the undergate had opened. He said the water had come through the old fall into the lower works, and the lower works are where people live, and that it had started 3 days ago and was getting worse. He said the fall that did it was the one from 2 years back. Everybody in that room turned and looked at me, because it was my fall, and it is the one they cut a rope over, and it had finally got round to the rest of them. We were a day short of the Ash March, at the last hall on the road, and the steward was halfway through calling the places when the man came in wet to the waist. He did not knock, and he did not wait to be spoken to. He said the water was in the lower works. He said the lower works are where 400 people live, that it had been coming since the 3rd hour, and that the old fall had opened under the weight of it like a seam. I stood up before he had finished. I did not hear my number that night, and to this day, I do not know what it was. It is the one thing I ever did that everybody agrees was correct, and it was not courage, and it was not a decision. I have carried things my whole life. When a room goes wrong, my hands start on the nearest thing that can be lifted. I came in through the upper gate at dawn, and the noise was the wrong noise. Water in a stone place under a hill does not roar, it hums. It comes up through the floor before it comes down the passage, and the first thing that tells you is a bucket standing in the wrong end of a room. I went to the kitchens. Everybody else went to the breach, and I have been asked about that a number of times since, by people who wanted me to have had a reason. There is no cleverness in it. There were 9 cooks and about 30 children who sleep down there because the kitchens are the warm part of that hill, and 150 stone of iron pot and a dry store under the floor with 2 feet of water standing in it already. I got them out. I counted them out loud at the door going up, all of them in 2s, because a count you say out loud is a count somebody can argue with you about, and then I counted them again in the upper yard and came out 1 short. The cook said, that is all of them. I said, it is not, and went back down, and it was a boy of about 6 asleep in the bread cupboard, who woke up when I picked him up and asked whether it was morning. Then I put water on. 4 cauldrons in the top yard over new fires, before there was one thing to put in any of them. Sevka came up at the 6th hour, with her arm bleeding, and stood looking at me doing it. She said, what in the name of the ash are you boiling? I said, water. She said, I can see that it is water. What is it for? I said, in about an hour, there will be 60 people up here who have been in that water to the chest, and every one of them will be cold in the way that kills, and there is no fire down there anymore because the fire is out. She said, and you knew that? I said, no. I said my mother did it in a bad winter when I was 6, and I have never once thought about it since, and my hands did it before the rest of me arrived. We were drinking out of those cauldrons by the 9th hour, and the physicians took 2 of them for the men they were bringing up, and Marash did not say thank you, which is how I knew it had been the right thing. The kitchen put me first in the queue at the pot that evening. They said it out loud in the upper yard, all of them at once, and the head cook said it twice over so that the people at the back of the crowd would have it. In a kitchen, that is the highest thing there is. The first bowl goes to whoever got them out. It is the only honor a kitchen owns, and they gave it to me in front of 200 people, and one of the cooks cried, and then apologized for crying. Barrow was at the top of the yard with the household. He had come up on the second cart and had spent the morning putting the plate in order because nobody had told him not to. Heard the kitchen call me first at the pot. Then he said the order for the evening meal of the house, top down, in one breath, in the middle of a flood, and I was not in it anywhere at all. Sevka said, "He is first at the pot." Barrow said, "He is." She said, "Then say him." He said, "The first man at a pot is a man standing up. A man standing up is not seated. The order is the list of who is seated." Then he asked whether the household would be eating at the usual hour. The same act, said out loud twice, by 2 mouths in 2 directions inside about a minute. The highest thing there is in one yard and out of the count entirely in the other. I have never worked out which of them was wrong, and I have come round to thinking neither of them was. I learned the next thing a long while afterwards, and I did not learn it from him, and there is no version of it in which anybody saw it happen. Corin Vale went down into the lower works on his own in the dark at about the 4th hour, before the household came up the road at all. He went because the guild's cart was down there, with the guild's name painted on the side of it, and he had been sent to get it back. The breach was at the second turn, a hole in the old fall about the width of a door, and the water was coming through it in a rope. The props on the near side were already going. There is nothing one man can do about that alone, and Vale knew it because he has 30 years in guild works and he can read a prop. What he did was turn the cart. That is a 2-horse job in that passage, and he had no horses, so he walked it round on its own wheels by the shafts and jammed it across the mouth of the breach on its side, and then put his shoulder against it and held it there while the water built up behind it. It was down there about 2 hours. The stone took the cart took the water, the pressure came off the props, and the props held. The passage those props carry is the one that runs under the sleeping rooms. Nobody came past. That is the whole of his luck. And it is the only real luck anybody had that day. He came up the north stair at the 7th hour, wet through, with both hands opened up, and by then the water was already dropping, and the cart was under it where it could not be seen. Outside, they were working the breach from the top, and it is the only place all that week where anybody laughed. Halva stood up on the spoil with the banner, because a banner is a mark men can find in smoke. He called the spoil in the stats bentans. There was smoke. There was so much smoke that nobody on that hill could see the banner, and she stood up there 4 hours in a rage, shouting at people to look at her. Iron Volk measured the breach. She went down the face of it on a rope with the knotted cord, came back up, and announced the width of it to the yard in a loud, clear voice. Nobody had asked. There was nothing anybody could do with the number. She has never regretted saying it. Arash took the water and divided it by mouthfuls. She said the order of drinking out loud from a barrel top, and she put the crown last on it, in front of the crown. Kadresh drank last. Nobody said one word about that, then or afterwards. And Barrow, at the 7th hour, in the middle of a broken hill with 200 people digging on it, announced the order of the household meal. Nobody had cancelled the meal hour. It has never been cancelled. He set it to a yard full of people covered in mud, and then went off to see about the plate. Kadresh found me at the kitchen fire at about the 10th hour. I was not at any table, because there was no table, and I would not have been at it in any case. I was turning bread on a stone with 2 cooks and a girl who had lost both her shoes. She came up the yard alone, with her sleeves pushed back to the elbow. She did not sit down, and she did not send anybody for a chair. She said, "I have been up and down this yard twice looking for you." I said, "I am sorry, they wanted feeding, and I was here already." She said, "Do not apologize to me for that." Then she stood there for a moment with her hands hanging, in a yard full of people, who were all watching her out of the corners of their eyes, and said, "Is there any of it going?" So the crown of the Ash March ate standing up at a kitchen fire. Out of a bowl a cook put in her hands, in the mud, with her sleeves rolled, in front of about 40 people. She stayed while she ate it and said nothing worth repeating. She asked the girl about her shoes and got the whole tale of them. The court did not hear it from her. She has never mentioned it once. They heard it from the kitchen, which is how that house hears everything that matters. By the next morning, the kitchen and the guardroom had settled between them what had happened, and were saying it aloud to anybody who would hold still. The senior of the guard put it in the shortest form there is, and I have heard it 100 times since. He said it standing on a crate with a bowl in his hand, to about a dozen men who all knew it already. He said the man got up from the table. At the Ash Court, that is the worst thing anybody can say about you. In their mouths, it came out the other way round, and by the end of that week, I heard a rider from the low road say it approvingly to a man who had never been within 9 days of the place. That was the first room that ever rated me, where there was no table in it at all, and I will take it over the year meal and everything that came with the year meal. The last thing in that yard I did not see either, and this one I had by the shortest route there is, which is that somebody told me at the time, and I did not believe her. I conservo ein Bachelorine. Andinai, there was a crush at the top of the stair when they brought the second lot up. 40 people in a space for 12, and somebody put a knife into the small of my back, through my coat, and did not get through the coat, because it is a porter's coat and has never let anything through it yet, rain included. I felt a push and thought it was an elbow. I went on carrying. I did not look round, and I have thought about that since, because a man who looks round is a man who sees a face, and I did not see one. Erin Volk was on the step above me, and she was the only one in that crush tall enough to see down into it. She did not shout. She came down through those people like weather, put her hand flat on my chest to stop me walking, and said one word to the yard. She said, "Knife." The whole of it stopped. Kadresh was 20 feet away, with a coil of rope in her hands, and I turned round to say it was nothing, and my coat was perfectly all right, and I saw her face before she got it back in order. So did the 200 people standing between us. The first meal back in the Ash Court after 40 days on the road was the strangest of my life, because everything in that hall was exactly where I had left it, and I was not. Barrow said the order top to bottom on one breath, with the man in it at the top, as though we had never gone anywhere at all. The 3 old ones had shuffled themselves twice while we were away, and he announced that as well, and nobody commented because nobody ever does. Then Kadresh said, before the second dish in front of everybody, that the man does not go out to the west guard room, does not carry, and is not to be found in any place where he is usually found, until she says otherwise. The hall took it as an order of the house, which is what it was. Erin Volk hummed. Halva looked pleased. Barrow folded it into the order that same evening, at the end, after who does not eat what, in the flat voice he keeps for the fish. I want to be fair to her, because it was the first thing anybody in that house had ever done for me instead of about me, and she did it badly. She said it at a table, in a hall with 30 people in it, 4 of whom serve, 2 of whom bring wood in from outside, and 1 from the low road who was there about horses. By the time the plate was cleared, every soul on that hill knew where the man would not be, and so where he would be instead. Corin Vale came in the next morning and tried to tell them what he had done, and he picked his moment badly, as he always did. It was the middle of the morning meal, with Erin Volk there and half the household. He stood up at the unfinished end and said that on the day of the breach he had gone down alone, turned the guild cart across the mouth of it, and held it there for 2 hours. There was a pause. Then one of the old ones said, "I beg your pardon," and asked him to say it again, and said it kindly, which was the beginning of the whole disaster. So he said it again. He said it more carefully the second time, which was his mistake, because a man saying a true thing carefully sounds like a man building something. Halva said she had not caught what he said about the cart. He said it a 3rd time. Sevka asked how a man turns a cart in that passage on his own, which is a real question with a real answer, and he started to explain the shafts and got about half a sentence in before he heard how it sounded and stopped. Then Erin Volk said, without any malice in it at all, that she had come down that passage at the 8th hour, and the cart was already across, and that she had assumed the water had put it there. That finished him. He said, and did the water turn it round? She hummed for a while and said, I did not think about it. He tried once more. He held up his hands, which were still opened across the palms and had been for a week, and said, look at these. And Marash, who had bound them for him herself 3 days before, and never said a word about it to anybody, said only that she would look at them again after the meal if he wanted her to. Barrow announced the night hour, and the room moved on, and Corin Vale sat down over a plate he did not touch, having told the truth to 9 people in a row. I have thought about that morning more than he would believe. I had a 1.5 years of that house disbelieving me in the other direction. all of them certain I was more than I said. He got the same thing pointed the other way, and I would not wish it on anybody, and he had earned it. I broke her ban on the 4th night, and I did not do it to make a point. The guardroom had come off 2 shifts on the breach, and there had been no soup up there since the day before, because the man who takes it had been told not to. That is all my reasoning was. They had not eaten, and a ban on where I go does not do one thing about that. So I took 2 pots up at the 9th hour, and I went the short way, past the woodpile, which is how I have gone 400 times, and which everybody in the world knows I go. They were waiting on the woodpile path, which anybody could have told them was the place, and I have since had to accept that I walked up it whistling with a pot in each hand. I did not see them, and I have never known how many there were. What I know is that the guardroom door was open because they were expecting the pots, and that the senior of them came out of that door at a run in his shirt with a bar in his hand and 4 men behind him. I did not fight anybody. I have never fought anybody. I got the door and held it, and counted the men back through it out loud in 2s, as I had counted the cooks out at the breach, and at the end of the count I was 1 short and said so, and 2 of them went out and brought him in. It was over in about the length of time it takes to boil a kettle. They lost nobody. One of them had his arm laid open to the bone, and one had a broken face, and the pots went over and there was soup all down that path, which the guardroom has never let me forget. Marash came up at the 10th hour and worked on the man with the arm on the guardroom table, and she was there until light. Somewhere in the middle of it, she said to nobody that she has 300 antidotes in that still room, and not one of them is any use against a man with a bar. What the 2 of them said before it, I had a long time afterwards from the listeners, and it is short. They were in a borrowed cloak in a barn on the low road, and they were choosing an hour. One of them said, he is not at the table anymore, he keeps to the kitchen, so it wants doing on the path. The other said, and the guard. The first one said, the guard eat at the 7th hour like everybody else on that hill. He was not stupid. He was working off the ordinary way of the world, in which soldiers eat when the kitchen says so. He had no way of knowing that the guard of the west gate eat when the man comes up the path with the pots, and had done it that way since my first winter. Then the court found out about it, and the next 4 days were the worst days of my life, and I have laughed at them ever since. They decided to guard me, not to increase the watch, not to double the gate. They decided individually and without consulting one another that each of them personally was going to keep me alive, and each of them had a method, and every method was correct. Aaron Folk measured every doorway on the kitchen side and came back with a number and a proposal, which was to brick up the passage door entirely. She said, a door that is not there cannot be come through. When I said the cooks used it, she hummed and said, they can go round. Arash tasted everything that came near me, including the water, twice, and then began tasting things that were merely in the room, and I once watched her taste a candle. Halva required me to walk under the banner. She walked behind me with it for 2 days, indoors, in a house with beams, and took the top off it on the passage lintel, and blamed the lintel. Isolde put a listener on every corner of that building, and by the 2nd day had 900 reports of the same nothing, and told me the man in the yard had looked at me strangely, and it was the man who has looked at everybody strangely for 60 years because of his eye. And Sevka simply lay down across the kitchen threshold in her coat with her boots off and slept there, and growled at anybody who came over her, including the head cook, including Barrow, including, on the 2nd night, the Crown. She said Dell once in her sleep and denied it in the morning. I could not get into my own kitchen for 4 days. I could not reach a pot. On the 3rd morning, I stood in the passage with an empty bucket and had to ask permission from a general to go and get my own bread. And she measured the doorway again before she let me through it. At the end of the 4th day, Kadrish came into the hall at the meal and told Barrow at the top of the table where the hall could hear it, that the order about where the man does not go was withdrawn. She did not soften it, and she did not explain it away. She said, I put a thing on him for his own good, and it put him on a path at a known hour, and the guardroom did not eat for 2 days. She said, I was wrong, and Barrow will take it out of the order tonight. Then she said the rest of it, and this is the thing I did not understand until much later. She said, and he was right, and he broke it, and I would rather have him breaking things than dead on a path because I could not think. Barrow took it out of the order. He announced the correction after the places and before who does not eat what, in the flattest voice anybody has ever used indoors, as he once announced the night hour, and a hall of 30 people heard a crown of 200 years unmake herself over a man with a mop. Halva said afterwards it was the finest thing she had ever heard at that table. Sevka said she had been saying it for a year and a half. Volk said nothing and measured the doorway. And then Yasevet, who had been in that hall the whole time with her hands folded, said the thing that spoiled it. She said, "Do you see it now?" She said, "They did not send a man up that path because they hate a porter." She said, "He is at your table, and a man at your table makes your crown a thing the nine can argue about, and so he is the softest place you have, and everybody on this continent worked that out before you did." Then she said, "That is the law of the 9 crowns. Up to now you have heard it as a sentence. Tonight you have heard what it is for." Nobody had an answer. Kadresh looked at the table for a while. I stood behind her chair with a jug, which is where I had been standing for a year and a half. And for the first time in the whole of it, I understood that I was not the one in danger. The herald of the council came in on the 9th day of that week, on a gray horse with the 9 crowns cut on the saddle, and would not come to the table. He said the crowns would seat themselves in their own hall, at their own table, which is 90 places. He said the Ash March would attend as an invited house. Then he read out who had been named, from memory, out loud, and it took him some little time, and the man was not anywhere in it. The Hall of the 9 Crowns is not anybody's house, and that is the entire point of it. And I was a while inside before I understood what that means. Everywhere I had been in 2 years, somebody owned the room. The Ash Court is hers. The garrison is Volk's. Even the dog bench above the ford belonged to a man who could move me up if he chose to. That hall belongs to 9 crowns at once, which means it belongs to none of them. A room with no owner has no mercy anywhere in it. There is nobody in it who can decide to be generous, because generosity is a thing you do with your own property, and every stone of that place is held in common by people who do not like one another. It is a table of 90 places in a stone room the length of 2 barns, and it is not a table you sit down at. It is a table you are called to, and the calling is done by a herald in green who has done nothing else with his life, and intends to do nothing else with what is left of it. The Ash March came as an invited house, which is a smaller thing than it sounds. We went up the steps behind 11 other households, and Barrow walked in front of our people with the plate list in his head and his face perfectly still, and did not look at the ceiling once, and everybody else did. The herald called the places from the top, and it took him most of an hour. He does not do it in one breath, he does it in 90, and he names the house and the crown, and the reason before he names the person. And the reason is the thing they are all listening for. There was no man in it, not at the bottom, not anywhere. When he had finished, a steward took me by the elbow without a word and put me against the wall behind the last row of backs where the door people stand. That is the 90th place. It is not a place at all. There is no chair there, and there is no name for it, and everybody in that hall knows precisely what it is, and the floor has a step in it just there, so that whoever is standing in it can see nothing whatever. Sevka, up in the gallery, said loudly into the middle of that silence that this hall had a great many chairs in it for a room that could not find one. They asked the Ash Court to be quiet, and it was the first of the 2 times they had to ask. Corin Vale had come south with the guild and had a seat at the 9th table, because the Iron Lantern is a house of standing, and about an hour in, he attempted the last clever thing of his life. Using a skysin like Kalinanasai, he stood up in his place and offered himself, well and short. He said, "The difficulty before this council is a human being at a demon table. I am a human being who has stood at that table for 2 years. I know its people and its customs, and I am the proper man to be the bridge." Then he said, "Take me, and let the porter go home." And he said that last bit quietly, which I think he had practiced. It was not stupid. If you were sitting in that room and had never been up the West Road, it was the sensible answer to the whole business, and I watched about 30 people nod at it. The elder crown did not deal with him. She let somebody else do it, and the one who did was a young crown from the Salt Coast, with a plain face and a bad coat, who said, "Before you go on, this council has one question for any man who wants to stand where he stands." He said, "Who threw you away?" Bale said, "I do not follow you." The young crown said, "It is not a difficult question. Every soul at that ash table is there because their own people tried to end them. It is the only rule that house has. So who tried to end you?" Vale stood there. I have felt sorry for that man exactly once in my life, and it was in that moment, and it did not last the afternoon, and I have gone over it a great many times since, and I still think it was real. Then Halva said, from the gallery, in a voice that got into every corner of that room, that she had put the same question to him at her own tables a year ago, and had offered him a place on her list for the answer, and that the offer had stood open all year, and he had never once come for it. They asked the Ash Court to be quiet. That was the second time, and after it, they put a steward on the gallery stair. Vale did not say anything. The young crown said, then you are not a bridge. You are a man who has never been unwanted, and asked the herald to take him out. The herald did not announce a place for him. There is no ceremony for that either. He went past me on his way to the door. We looked at each other for about the space of one breath, and neither of us said a word, and it is the closest the two of us had come to speaking since the day he asked me whether the water was fresh. The knife came up an hour later, and it was dealt with as that room deals with everything, which is to say not at all. Somebody asked whether it was known who had put a man on the woodpile path, and an old crown from the north, who had said nothing for 2 hours, said that if a purse had been raised for it, half the houses in that room would have put money into it, and the other half would want to know why they had not been asked. Nobody argued, nobody was shocked. There was no inquiry, no calling of witnesses, no going into any of it. It was said aloud in front of 90 people by a man eating a pear, and then the hall moved along to the next thing on the herald's list. That is the difference between that room and every other room I have stood in. At the Ash Court, they tell you what they think of you. In that hall, they tell you what they intend, and then they eat fruit. Then the pass came up because it had to. The Iron Lantern wants the road through the Ash March, and the whole continent knew it by then. And a crown from the west said that nobody at that table could speak to the state of the Ash Road with any authority at all. And I said, from the wall, that I could. 90 people turned round at once, and one of them dropped a cup, and I have never in my life wanted so much to be somewhere with a bucket in it. Nobody had ever spoken from the door place in the memory of anybody in that room. I found out afterwards there is not even a rule against it, because nobody had ever needed to make one. The herald looked at Yasavet. Yasavet looked at her own plate and said, let him talk. I said the road is passable 8 months of the year, and the ford bridge has been down since spring. I said the guild wants it because the seaway costs them 4 extra weeks, and their winter is arithmetic. I said the Ash Crown has never closed that road to anybody in 200 years. Then I said the last of it, which is that everybody in this hall knows that already, and has spent the morning talking as though they do not. That is all I said, and it took about half a minute, and my voice went on me twice in the middle of it. The herald said, the man is called forward to the first 100 steps. Then he explained himself for the benefit of the households at the back, and said that a voice which carries usefully to the throne is seated where the throne can hear it. He moved me up the hall into the crowd. There is no chair there either, but there is floor and there is light on it, and people turn round when you speak. Barrow, in the gallery, said out loud to nobody in particular, the man is at the first 100 steps, in exactly the voice he uses at home for the fish. The herald of the 9 crowns stopped what he was doing and looked up at him with an expression I intend to keep for the rest of my life. Sevka whistled. Halva slapped the rail with her open hand. 2 crowns turned round to see who was making that noise in their hall, and one of them laughed out loud. The third row is the row they ask. To get there, you must be asked something, and to stay there, you must answer it. And the crowns took about a quarter of an hour to settle among themselves what they were going to ask me. It came in the end from a woman of the Eastern Reach, with 3 rings on one hand and no patience in her at all. She said, they say you have something. Every telling that comes off that road says the Ash Crown keeps a human for a reason. So tell this hall what you are. The room went quiet in a way I recognized. It was the same quiet as the night Vale called me a charity case, and I had a year and a half more in me than I had then. And I found I was not frightened of it. I said, I am a human being. I said, the crown eats what I cook because the kitchen sends things up too hot and somebody has to carry them. I said, I mend boots, I keep a floor, I know who at that table will not take vinegar, and I get up early. Then I said, there is nothing I do in a day that any porter in this hall could not do by the end of the week. Nobody said anything at all. Then the woman with the rings said, that is the least any man has ever said about himself in this room. And she said it as though she were making a note of something for later. And then the herald did his duty, because in that hall every word spoken from the third row is repeated aloud by the herald, so that the whole table has it exactly. It is an old rule and it was made for treaties. He repeated all of it. He said it in the ceremonial voice, at full carry, into a hall of 90 crowns and their households, and he did not leave out one word. He said the boots, he said the floor. He said, and I know who at that table will not take vinegar. And he said it the way a man reads out the terms of a truce, and then he waited a moment before going on, because that is where the pauses go. At the Ash Court, that would have been the funniest thing anybody had heard in 100 years. In that hall, about 15 people laughed and then stopped because the crowns were not laughing. They were not laughing because they had just watched a man decline to be more than he was in a room where nobody has ever once done it. Then the herald said it out. Aistrudanis Arferots. The man is called to the third row. Yasavet came out to me that night among the carts and made me the offer, and I will be exact about it, because I have heard it told since as a trap, and it was not. She said, sit with me. I have a house and 900 years of standing, and nobody in it who tells me the truth in a plain voice. Come to me. I will give you a name since you have not got one, and a place at my own table that no council on this continent can take off you. Then she said, you would never stand at anybody's door again as long as you lived, and she meant it as the kindness in the offer, and she was not wrong about what it is worth. I said no, and I said it too fast, and she told me to think about it for a night. I said I had not got a night in me. Then I said the rest, and it came out badly, because it was the first time any of it had been out of my mouth. I said, she made a law 200 years ago that filled her house with people who had been thrown away, and every one of them is hers because of it, and she has never once known what any of them would do if the law were taken off them. I said, I am the only one at that table who was never held by it, because I never understood it, and if I go with you, she will never find out. I said, I would like her to find out. I said, that is the only thing I have ever wanted in that house. Yasavet stood there in the dark with her hood up for a while. Then she said, and if you stay, does she find out? I said, no. She only finds out if I stay when there is somewhere better to go, and you have just been kind enough to build me one. She said, that is the second time you have answered a question I did not know the answer to. And she went in, and I finished roping the carts. 2 people heard that in the yard, and neither of them was close enough for all of it. By the next evening, half the council had it, that the porter had been offered a name and a seat, and was holding out for better terms. By the morning after, one telling had him asking for a crown of his own. Kadresh heard it from a steward of a house she does not like, at the door of the hall in front of 2 of her own generals. She came and found me at the carts, and she was not grateful and she was not moved. She was as angry as I have ever seen her, and she has been angry at me twice in my life. She said, you refused the elder crown of this continent in a yard, at night, with nobody there. I said, yes. She said, why did you not come to me first? I said, because you would have told me to take it. She said, of course I would have told you to take it. Then she said, and I would have wanted to hear you say no to my face, and instead I have had it off a man I would not buy a horse from. Then she went back into that hall and did not speak to me for 2 days. The herald came out onto the steps at the end of it, to give the hall the shape of the morning. He said the tables would be settled at the 3rd hour, and then he said the rule of that settling, which every person there knew and not one of them had said out loud in front of me. He said, at this table a place is not given. A place is vacated. Then he went in and shut the door, and that entire yard stood about in the dark, working out what it had just been told. The night before the tables were settled, the leg came off the chair she had brought from home, and that is how the 2 of us stopped being angry with each other. She had it upside down on a trestle in the yard when I came out, and she was looking at it the way people look at a thing they mean to fix and have no notion how to. I said, the tenon has gone. She said, I can see it has gone. I said, it has not gone, it has dried, and there is a difference. So I went and got a wedge and some hide glue off the carters, and we did it together in the dark, and she held the leg while I drove the wedge, which is exactly the work Iron Volk did for me at a gate 2 years before that. Then I got out my old lantern. It had been in my kit since the day they carried me up out of the undergate, broken in 4 places, and I had never once had a reason to mend it. I mended it there on the cart tail with her holding the frame steady and complaining about the light. Neither of us said one word about the elder crown, or the yard, or the 2 days. She asked me for the pliers twice. That is all the reconciliation there was, and I would not change 1 minute of how it went. At the 3rd hour, the herald opened the hall and said the rule out loud, so that no household could afterwards claim it had not been given to them plainly. He said, at this table a place is not given, a place is vacated. He said, for a man to be seated here, one who is seated must stand and say the reason aloud, and whoever stands does not sit at this table again. Not that day, not in 10 years, not ever. Then the crown from the north, the one who had eaten the pear, said what the whole room was thinking, and he said it comfortably, as you say a thing that cannot go wrong. He said, then let us go on, because nobody has vacated a place at this table in 90 years, and nobody will do it this morning for a porter. Mirash stood up. She did it fast, before he had finished, with her hand in the air like a woman at a market, and she said, I vacate. And then she said, and I will give the reason, and I want it taken down properly. She held up the spoon. She said, I have kept the poisons of the ash court for 140 years, and I have tasted every plate that woman has eaten in all that time. She said, I gave that spoon to a kitchen boy to test his own food with, and he has never once tested anything with it. He stirs the gate guard's soup with it. He ate what I gave him in the house where they poisoned me, in front of the people who poisoned me, and asked me for more. Then she went and sat down on the floor at the wall, and she has never sat at that table since, and she was in a thoroughly good mood about it for the rest of the day. Erin Volk stood up second, and hummed for so long that the herald began to move, and then she said, I vacate. She said, in my house there is a doorpost with 2 marks cut into it 2 seasons apart, and they are the height of a man who does not know they are there. Mapondait and diet isaltai. She said, I have measured walls for 40 years, and I have never once measured a thing that was going to be taller in the spring. The herald said, the man is called to the near end of the table. They walked me up the length of that hall, past 60 households, and put me where the crowns can hear an answer without leaning. And I stood there in a coat with grease on the shoulder of it, and could not think of one thing to do with my hands. Sevka stood up third, and she did not make a speech, because she cannot. She said, I vacate. Then she said, that man asked a house full of generals to leave their boots at the door because he was the one washing the floor, and every one of us did it, and not one of us can tell you why. She said, I am the only one who ever did it properly. She said, I liked the noise. Then she said, that is my reason, and sat down on the floor at the wall, because by then there was no chair left over there to sit on. Isolde stood up forth and took the flower out from behind her ear and held it up where the hall could see it. She said, I vacate. She said, I have 900 listeners on this continent, and I have known everything about everybody for 200 years. She said, in all that time, not one person has ever asked me a question about myself. He asked me what the flower meant. I did not know the answer, and I told him so, and it is the only conversation of my life. I could not have finished before it began. Halva stood up fifth, and she had the banner with her, because of course she did. She unrolled the whole of it in that hall with 2 of her own people holding the pole, and it is a bad banner, and every soul in that room could see that it is a bad banner. She said, I vacate. Then she turned the cloth over and showed them the corner she had put on it that winter, which is a chair, stitched crooked with 9 little marks going up the side of it. She said, my own people burned my first one, rather than pay me a share. This one has a kitchen chair on it, and I have never been prouder of anything in my life, and I would like the hall to note that I am the only person in this room who has embroidered anything. Barrow, who had come down from the gallery because a butler goes where his house goes, said out loud, without being asked, which of the 5 had risen earliest, in order from Mirash to Halva, and corrected the herald once on the matter of Sevka. It is the last time in any of this that he had to do it, and he did it exactly as he did it at a supper table 2 years before, and I would like that remembered about him when I am dead. Then the council did the thing they had kept for the morning, and it was the only card they had left. And I could see the young crown from the Salt Coast did not enjoy holding it. He said, there is one man in this hall who knew that person before any of this began, and he belongs to the guild. Let him tell us what the porter was. They brought Corinvale back in. Nobody sat him down. There was no witness place and no oath and no paper anywhere in that room, because there never is. A crown asks, and you answer in front of everybody, and what you say is what you are afterwards. The young crown said, you had him 2 seasons. What was he? And the hall settled itself as a room settles when it is expecting to be told something it can use. I was 6 feet away and looking straight at his face, so I will say what I saw. He worked out the answer that would have finished me. It was there, and it would have taken him 1 sentence. This was a man who had gone south alone to 9 doors to say the ash crown keeps a human, and he was good at it. Then he said he carried. The young crown said, that is not an answer. Vale said, it is the only one I have got. He said, for 2 seasons that man carried everything the rest of us carried, and he carried the difference as well, and he never once put a load onto anybody smaller than himself. and I never learned his name because I never had to ask him for anything twice. Then he stopped. Then he said the last of it to the floor. He said, and I cut the rope on him, and every one of you knows it, and none of you cares. And that is the only thing in this whole business that has ever surprised me. At the ash court, what he had just described has a name. Barrow said it out loud from where he was standing, because a butler answers when his house is asked a question, and he said it in the voice he uses for the fish. He said, at our table, that is the second person of the house. A herald put his hand up to call the fifth threshold, and Yasevet stood up before he could get to it. She stood up last, an old woman in a bad coat in a room she had been the first crown of for 900 years, and she said, I vacate. And the hall made a noise I have not heard before or since. She said, 200 years ago, a girl asked me if she might write a rule that took in the throne away, and I let her write it because it was pretty. I have watched it used as a weapon on this continent ever since, by her and by others, and I have never once seen it do the thing she said it would do. Then she said, I have seen it now, and I am too old to sit at a table where I have been proved wrong, and I would sooner stand up and say so first than be the last one in the room to notice. She had her chair brought in, the black one that has gone in front of her on a cart since before any of us were born, and she gave it to the ash march. She said, put it by the door of that hall. She said, the door is where the interesting people stand. The herald drew breath to call me to the right hand of that table, which is the fifth threshold, and the last one there is, and I stood up before he got it out. I said, no, and I said it loudly, because the hall is long, and I was at the wrong end of it. I said, 5 of them have vacated a place they can never sit in again, and one of them is 900 years old, and I am not going to walk up this hall over the top of that and sit down in a chair. I said, I would like to give them back. The herald said a vacated place cannot be returned. I said, then let them sit at somebody else's table, and let this one stand empty, and let anybody who wants to know why ask the 9 crowns about it in 100 years. Then I asked for a stool by the door. I said, I have stood at a door my whole life, and I am good at it, and I can see everybody from there. And I said the true thing, which I had not planned and had never said to anybody except an old woman in a yard. I said, there is a law in that house that holds every person at that table, and it has never held me, because nobody ever explained it. And by the time I understood it, I was already staying. I said, I would like to go on being there without it. I said, that is the only thing I have ever asked anybody for. Nobody in that hall said anything for a while. Then Kadresh got up out of the place they had given her at the top of the 9, and she did not say one word to the council, and she picked up her own chair. She carried it down the length of that hall herself, past 60 households and 90 places, and she set it down next to the stool by the door, and she sat in it. So a table of 90 places that has settled the shape of this continent for 900 years found itself facing entirely the wrong way, with the crown of the ash march at the back of the room beside a stool, and the herald standing at the top of it with his hand still in the air. The pass was given in one sentence, and the price was in the same sentence. She said, the Iron Lantern may use the Ash Road for as long as this hall stands, and in return, the Iron Lantern will seat its own house by our order, in its own hall, at every meal, forever. Nobody wrote anything down. Nothing was signed. 2 crowns nodded, and the young one from the Salt Coast laughed out loud, and that was the whole of it. And the guild had won the thing it had been trying to buy for 2 years, and lost the only thing it actually owned, which was the shape of its own dining room. I was there when they did it the first time. Aldrin Voss stood in his own hall in front of his own people, while a man read the order by the ash rule, top down, one breath, and the master of the Iron Lantern was placed below a crate. It is the crate by the door where the porters sit to change their boots. I had sat on it myself for 2 seasons. Voss sat below it, because at that table a man is placed by who has thrown him away, and nobody has wanted rid of Aldrin Voss for 1 hour of his life. Oren Vale did not sit at all. He stood at the end of the hall where the man with the order pointed, and he stood there the whole meal, and afterwards he came over to me by the door and said, Dell, 2 seasons of carrying his kit, and 2 years of standing in the same rooms as him, and that was the first time. I said, that is right. He said, I am going back down the undergate in the spring with the shoring crews. I said, take a hand line and check it yourself before you put anybody on it. He said he intended to. I went down the undergate the following week. On a rope I had checked myself, with my own lantern mended and lit, and the water gone and the floor dry, and I stood at the bottom of that shaft where I had once lain, adding up my life. Above me at the top, I could hear the porters of the Iron Lantern calling their own order for the midday meal, in their own mouths, out loud, with their own names in it. They had made it up themselves that month, and nobody had told them to. And afterwards, when all of it had settled, there were 5 small things I was never anywhere near, and I have had every one of them described to me by somebody who was there. Sevka, asleep until noon on a bench in the sun, with her boots off, and 2 riders standing over her sleep on their own initiative. Mirage at the end of a table watching a room of strangers finish what she had cooked without one of them looking at it first. Aaron Volk eating a bowl of something she had not guarded, outdoors, watching a wall that was no business of hers. And Isolde asking a girl of 19 a question and waiting, with her face doing nothing at all, for an answer she did not have in advance. And Halva standing in a yard for 4 days in the rain while a man with bad knees painted her getting down off a horse. They cut that rope on me on purpose, and they were careful about it, and they did not do one other thing carefully all year. Best rope anybody ever cut. Barrow came to the door of the hall at the usual hour with the order in his mouth, and said it from the top down in one breath, and put the man on the stool by the door, and said, "Who does not eat what?" and said the house would be quiet from the 9th hour, and did not find any of it worth remarking on.
A boy went down a hole because somebody above him decided it was cheaper to explain a body than a mistake. What he did afterwards was not clever. He carried what wanted carrying. He told the truth in rooms where truth bought him nothing, and in a house where everybody spent their lives dragging a chair towards the top. He pushed his away. 5 ancient women stood up forever over a spoon, a doorpost, a pair of boots, a dried flower, and a badly stitched banner, because those were the only things anybody had ever given them without a reason. If you want to know what you are worth to a room, do not count where they seat you. Count who stands up when it costs them their own place.